Imagine, for a moment, the gentle glow of a lantern flickering in a drafty medieval hall. Its light is not bright, but soft and golden, pushing back the shadows only a little, leaving most of the chamber wrapped in a quiet dusk. The stone walls breathe coolness, and the faint smell of wood smoke lingers where a fire has burned earlier in the day. Somewhere beyond the walls, a river moves slowly through mist, its surface untroubled, carrying reflections of stars. Time, in such a place, feels as though it walks in slow steps, unhurried, measured, patient. Outside, narrow streets rest in near silence. The wooden beams of houses creak softly in the night air, as if sighing. A cart, left abandoned by a merchant, tilts slightly on uneven cobblestones. Now and then, a dog barks distantly, but the sound fades quickly, swallowed by the fog. A watchman passes with a lantern of his own, its faint glow swaying with each step. He mutters a prayer beneath his breath, more from habit than fear. It is night, the kind of night where the world itself seems to exhale, where every window shutter closed and every door bolted whispers of rest. This was the world of medieval kingsmen who sat upon carved thrones, wrapped in cloaks of fur, velvet, and power. Yet even amid their ceremonies and councils, even beneath the glitter of jewels and the murmur of courtiers, they carried quieter fascinations. They were men who pondered the hidden. They looked for patterns in symbols, for meanings in letters, for secrets behind words. Codes became a kind of mirror, reflecting their desire for control in a world where harvests might fail, storms might rise, and loyalty might falter. In the hush of their chambers, secrecy was not merely a tool. It was a pastime, a private meditation, a way to order the restless thoughts of rule. And yet, our journey here will not concern itself with the sharp edges of intrigue or the heavy weight of conflict. Instead, let us wander through the gentler corners of that world. Let us step quietly into gardens where roses open to the morning dew, and into libraries where parchment waits for careful hands. We may sit for a while beside the long desks of the scriptorium, listening to the patient rasp of quills against vellum. We may pause in courtyards where sunlight warms the cobblestones, or in kitchens where the smell of baking bread mingles with herbs from the nearby fields. This is not a tale of urgency, but of lingering observation, where the smallest details carry the greatest comfort. Consider the parchment itself, stretched and smoothed from animal skin, its surface faintly textured beneath the fingers. Freshly prepared, it carried the earthy scent of its making, a reminder that even writing began in the humble work of shepherds and tanners. Onto this surface, ink would be laid dark, glistening as it dried, shining faintly in the candlelight. To fill a page with letters, whether in plain Latin or in careful cipher, was a task that slowed time. Each stroke of the quill was deliberate, each word a small act of patience. For those who enjoyed secrecy, the act of encoding a message was less about haste and more about rhythm. Like embroidery or weaving, it was a quiet craft. So too, in their halls, kings found stillness in these secret amusements. A parchment filled with curious signs could rest on a table beside untouched wine, waiting to be studied. To look upon such a page was not unlike gazing into the embers of a fire. Shapes emerged, vanished, and reappeared, teasing the imagination. Courtiers might drift through, speaking softly, but the king's thoughts were far away, following the dance of symbols into quiet meditation. Codes were not always about hidden plots. Sometimes they were simply about the pleasure of mystery, the delight of arranging letters into patterns that felt orderly in a world often unpredictable. Beyond the castle walls, too, secrecy appeared in gentler forms. In markets, merchants marked their debts with signs known only to themselves. In fields, farmers read the language of weather, as though the sky itself wrote its own coded message in clouds and winds. In chapels, chants rose and fell with patterns that carried both music and meaning. Life itself, when observed closely, seemed to whisper in symbols. To those with patient minds, the world was full of ciphers, each one a reminder that nothing need be taken only at its surface. It is in this slower rhythm that we shall linger. Imagine walking beneath the vaulted beams of a great hall, your footsteps softened by rushes spread across the floor. Imagine hearing the soft rustle of garments as courtiers move by, their voices lowered, their words chosen carefully. Or picture yourself seated in a cloister garden, where ivy climbs stone walls and the air is filled with the fragrance of rosemary and thyme. Here, in such calm spaces, The love of hidden words grew like the herbs themselves, quietly, steadily, offering a kind of comfort to those who tended them. So, as you lie back now, allow your thoughts to follow this unhurried path. Let your eyes grow heavy as the details form a tapestry, lanterns glowing faintly, rivers carrying reflections, quills scratching slowly, codes unfolding like delicate knots. We will not chase after battles, nor weigh crowns heavy with jewels. Instead, we will drift among the gentler landscapes of medieval life, guided by the quiet curiosity of kings who found solace in secrecy. For theirs was a world not only of power, but of patient puzzles, of calm patterns, of hidden words that invited reflection more than revelation. This is not a tale of conflict, but a gentle exploration. It is a meandering walk through mist and shadow, firelight and parchment. It is a reminder that even in the most powerful halls, there was room for quiet wonder. As we journey together, you may find the steady rhythm of this history drawing you toward rest. Let the words fall softly, like leaves in an autumn courtyard. Let them settle around you until the world feels still. And if sleep comes, let it come gently, carrying you into dreams where lanterns flicker, rivers whisper, and parchment waits, filled with hidden words known only to you. The first light of morning touched the palace slowly, as if hesitant to disturb its stillness. Mist curled along the ground, wrapping the gardens in pale veils that softened the shapes of hedges, trees, and winding paths. A robin sang somewhere, deep within the hedgerow, its call sharp yet gentle, carried on the cool breath of dawn. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and crushed grass, a fragrance that only came after a night of heavy dew. This was the hour when the palace lay most peaceful. The kitchens had not yet fully stirred. The clatter of pots and the chatter of servants were still only whispers behind wooden doors. Guards walked softly along the stone walls, their torches guttering low, about to be replaced by the light of day. Within these quiet spaces, the king sometimes chose to walk, draped in a cloak to shield against the chill. He would step into his gardens, not for ceremony, but for thought. And among the rose bushes and herbs, he carried with him a fascination that few outside his private circle understood. His love of codes and hidden words. The gardens were not merely a place of beauty, they were a kind of living manuscript. Pathways formed patterns when seen from above, hedges trimmed into shapes that suggested order and meaning. The spiral of a snail shell lying in the damp soil might catch the king's eye, its curve reminding him of the endless ways letters could be arranged. Nature itself seemed to speak in symbols, rings of tree trunks, lattice of frost upon leaves, ripples moving outward on the surface of the garden pond. Gardeners, moving slowly with shears and baskets, noticed his quiet steps, but rarely spoke. Their work was patient and rhythmic, trimming, sweeping, gathering herbs, still wet from the dew. They too lived by pattern, seasons dictating their tasks, the turning of the year shaping their routine as surely as any code shaped a page. For the king, this daily work around him mirrored the steady labor of scribes indoors, each cut of shears or scratch of quill adding to a larger design. Inside the palace, not far from these hedges, scribes were preparing for the day. Parchment had been set out, quills sharpened to fine points, inkpots filled with dark liquid that shimmered faintly in candlelight. Letters would soon be copied, messages drafted, records carefully kept. But for now, their chambers remained hushed. The faint sound of sweeping rushes being replaced on the floor was the only sign of life. The king knew that soon he would return indoors to these tasks of rule. Yet for the moment, the garden gave him space to breathe, to order his thoughts through the quiet language of nature's patterns. Sometimes he paused before the rose bushes. Their thorns, sharp but hidden beneath soft petals, reminded him of secrets, beauty on the surface, danger concealed within. At other times, he studied the way vines wrapped around trellises, twisting but never breaking their rhythm. To an idle onlooker, this was mere wandering. But for the king, every detail offered a meditation, each shape a reminder that meaning could be hidden in plain sight. In medieval courts, codes were not always born of grand conspiracy. More often, they were tools for reassurance, ways to secure a message, ways to feel in control of what might otherwise be uncertain. A letter folded and sealed could carry simple words, but when written in cipher, it became more than communication. It became a puzzle, a guarded treasure, a silent companion for thought. The king's garden walks were part of this same rhythm, Just as a scribe might enjoy the feel of pen on parchment, the king enjoyed seeing patterns in the ordinary. The ripple of water in the fountain could recall the looping of letters. The arrangement of herbs in neat rows might resemble the lines of a page. Even the flight of birds startled from a tree could remind him of scattered symbols, briefly ordered before fading into the sky. Beyond their aesthetic, gardens in medieval times served practical needs. Beds of thyme, rosemary, and sage offered flavor for the kitchens and remedies for the physicians. Monks in monasteries and gardeners in royal estates alike treated these spaces as both sustenance and sanctuary. A garden was never idle, it healed, it nourished, it soothed. For a king, it also inspired. The blending of beauty and purpose reflected the balance he sought in his own rule. Secrecy not only as protection, but as art. The gardeners who tended these plants worked steadily, often unnoticed. Their hands grew rough from shears and soil, their backs bent from lifting water buckets from wells. Yet in their daily rhythm lay a wisdom the king himself admired. To tend a rose or herb was to believe in patterns of growth, in patience, in the unfolding of design that took months, even years. In his codes, too, patience was essential. To build a cipher was not a task of moments but of hours, sometimes days, of careful rearranging. Both gardener and king practiced a quiet form of endurance. The light grew stronger. Mist began to lift, revealing more clearly the shapes of trimmed hedges, the straight lines of gravel paths, the glint of dew still caught on blades of grass. Servants started their morning routines, carrying bread from ovens, fetching water from wells, preparing chambers for the day. Life slowly expanded outward from silence into gentle activity, yet the garden retained its calm. Its walls of stone and hedge kept the world beyond at a distance. Inside, there was still only the sound of birds, the whisper of wind, and the measured footsteps of a king lost in thought. If we pause here, we may feel what he felt, the sense that even the smallest things can carry hidden meaning. The curl of a fern uncurling in spring, the rhythm of bees moving from flower to flower, the circular ripples from a stone dropped in water, all of these spoke to a medieval mind trained to look for signs. It was not superstition, nor paranoia, but simply a way of seeing. The world was full of messages, waiting to be read. And so, in the stillness of morning, the garden became both retreat and inspiration. It was a canvas upon which the king's thoughts painted themselves. A living code, written not in ink, but in light, shadow, and the designs of nature. By midday, he would leave this place and step into the busier halls of rule. Scribes would bring him records, letters, and perhaps even a cipher to study. Courtiers would speak, councils would gather, decisions would be made. But the morning garden walk gave him something more subtle. It gave him a rhythm of calm to carry into the day. It gave him reminders that even in power, quiet observation mattered. That secrecy could be soft as dew, patient as a rose, enduring as stone walls warmed by sun. And as the day grew louder, he carried that silence within him. The scriptorium was never loud. It was a place of stone, cool even in summer, where silence gathered like another inhabitant. The walls were thick, blocking the noises of the courtyard beyond. Footsteps on the flagstones echoed softly, then disappeared. Windows were narrow, letting in only narrow blades of light, but that was enough. In the quiet, monks and scribes bent over long wooden desks, their backs curved, their faces steady with concentration. The air smelled of vellum, of tallow candles, of ink brewed from oak galls. It was not unpleasant, was earthy, grounding, a reminder that even the loftiest work began with materials drawn from the soil, from trees, from creatures that grazed in fields. The sound most often heard here was not the chant of monks or the clatter of feet, but the faint, rhythmic rasp of quills across parchment. Each stroke made a soft scratching, like the murmur of a cricket at night, delicate yet persistent. When many scribes worked together, the sounds wove into a kind of music, gentle, repetitive, steady. It was the hum of thought turned into words, and words turned into permanence. The king, who sometimes walked these halls, relied deeply upon such men. They were not warriors, nor lords of land, yet they carried the kingdom's memory. In their hands lay the keeping of treaties, the copying of scripture, the recording of harvests, the drafting of secret codes. Without their patience, knowledge would slip away, words would vanish, messages would be lost to time. The king could trust a knight to guard his chamber, but he trusted a scribe to guard his meaning. To prepare the writing was itself a craft. The parchment was not simply paper, but animal skin, carefully scraped, washed, and stretched until smooth. When a fresh sheet was laid upon the desk, it carried with it a faint, earthy scent, a whisper of the pasture from which it had come. The scribes, trained to notice every detail, felt the grain beneath their fingers. They tested their quills by trimming them with small knives, dipping them into ink that shimmered darkly in shallow pots. Each line they wrote was deliberate. Each letter, a small act of devotion not only to the king who commissioned it, but to the idea of order itself. The rhythm of their labor echoed prayer. In monasteries, time was measured by bells, and between the bells, work continued in silence. Writing was a prayer made visible, steady, humble, repeating. The scribes who copied sacred texts did so with reverence, but even those who worked on royal codes treated their task with a similar calm. A cipher was not only a puzzle of secrecy, it was also an arrangement of lines and shapes, as beautiful in its way as an illuminated letter. Sometimes a page shone with color gold leaf pressed into tiny details, bright pigments drawn from minerals or plants. But even when no decoration was added, there was beauty in the quiet balance of letters. Each one was carefully placed, no haste, no crowding. To read a medieval page is to see patience made visible. To hear the scratch of the quill is to listen to patience at work. Within these stone walls, life followed its own rhythm. A candle guttered and was replaced. A scribe shifted on his stool, stretching tired fingers before returning to his task. A small cough might echo, quickly swallowed by the silence again. The day moved slowly, yet steadily, each moment a continuation of the last. For the scribes, this was not dullness but comfort. In repetition, they found steadiness. In silence, they found room for thought. The king's codes, when they arrived, were often copied in the same manner. Sometimes they were simple substitutions, one letter for another. Sometimes more elaborate, where entire phrases hid beneath symbols. The scribes did not question why. Their task was to set the words faithfully, line by line, until meaning, whether clear or concealed, was secured upon parchment. The tools of their work reflected this quiet world. Quills cut from goose feathers, sharpened with care. Ink mixed from oak galls, iron salts, and a little wine, its color darkening as it dried. Sand or blotting powders sprinkled to set the ink. Small knives to trim mistakes, smoothing the parchment once more. Nothing was wasted, nothing hurried. Even the posture of the scribes, stooped but steady, was a kind of discipline. The scriptorium's light was dim but purposeful. Windows were high, letting in beams of daylight that angled across the desks. Dust motes drifted in the shafts of light, rising and falling with every movement. At times, the glow of candles joined the sun, their flames flickering against the cold stone. The shadows lengthened as the day wore on, but the work did not cease until the bell called for meal or prayer. For the scribes themselves, life was not glamorous, but it carried a quiet dignity. Their days were long, their hands often cramped, their eyesight strained from peering at small letters. Yet they were keepers of knowledge, guardians of continuity. They knew that what they wrote might endure beyond their lifetimes. A single page might outlast wars, outlast rulers, even outlast the very stones of the palace. The thought gave their labor meaning. And so, while knights polished swords and merchants weighed coins, the scribes polished letters, weighed words. Their battlefield was parchment, their weapon a quill, their armor silence. What they produced was less visible than banners or castles, yet more enduring. Words written on vellum could travel through centuries, whispering still when the gardens outside had long since changed. There was also a spiritual calm in their work. For monks, the act of writing scripture was a prayer in itself, an offering of time and focus. For secular scribes, serving a king, there remained a sense of devotion, not only to ruler, but to order, to clarity, to the craft. To set words in straight lines, to keep margins clean, to mark each page with care, was to bring harmony out of chaos. The world beyond might shift with politics and storms, but within the scriptorium, the order of letters remained steady. The king valued this steadiness. He may have delighted in ciphers, in secret meanings hidden in signs, but he knew the foundation lay in the patience of these men. Without their hands, his codes would remain thoughts only, fragile as smoke. With their hands, they became lasting, protected, part of the quiet machinery of rule. As the day wore toward evening, the scriptorium changed its face. Shadows stretched long across the floor. Candles were lit, their flames trembling against the gathering dusk. The scratch of quills slowed, then ceased as scribes set aside their tools. Pages were stacked neatly, ink dried and set. Some pages bore the king's seal, others waited for his eyes, others still would be tucked into bindings of leather. The silence deepened, now less filled with activity and more with rest. Outside, the courtyard grew louder, children calling, servants carrying buckets, the clang of iron from the smithy. But within the stone walls, the calm endured. The scribes, stepping away from their desks, carried with them the quiet of the day. They knew tomorrow it would begin again. Fresh parchment, fresh ink, the same soft rasp of quills, the same rhythm of patience. If we close our eyes, we might still hear it. The gentle scratching of quills, steady as breath, marking the slow passage of time. It is not the sound of urgency, nor of drama, but of devotion. A devotion to words, to meaning, to secrecy when needed, but always to endurance. In the cool stone chambers of the scriptorium, history was not shouted, but whispered, and those whispers remain, written carefully on pages that outlived the voices that made them. The scriptorium was not a place of spectacle. It was not where battles were won, nor where feasts were held, but it was where meaning was preserved. Its quiet scratch was the heartbeat of a kingdom's memory, and though centuries have passed, though many walls have crumbled, the memory of that scratch still lingers in old books, in faded ink, in the patience of words that remain. And so the chapter of the scriptorium closes, not with noise, but with silence. A silence that comforts, a silence that endures, a silence that waits like the stillness before sleep. The marketplace was never silent, yet its sounds formed their own rhythm, as measured and familiar as the scratch of quills in the scriptorium. Here the air was different, filled not with the smell of vellum and ink, but with the sense of bread, warm from ovens, of herbs tied in bundles, of wool newly shorn and carried in rough baskets. The voices of sellers rose and fell like waves, sometimes sharp, sometimes gentle. Beneath the bustle, however, there was a quieter layer, the subtle marks, numbers, and symbols that moved hand to hand, stall to stall, carrying meaning in ways not always visible to the untrained eye. A king, if he passed through such a place, would have noticed it, perhaps not at first, for his eyes would be drawn to the more obvious sights, the flashes of color in dyed fabrics, the sheen of pewter cups, the tumbling of apples in a wooden cart. But if he lingered, if he slowed, he might have seen how meaning traveled silently between the stalls. A small chalk mark on a board, a tally notched into wood, a wax seal pressed with a merchant's private symbol. These were not secrets in the royal sense, not cloaks and dagger codes of diplomacy, yet they belonged to the same family of hidden communication. For the people of the market, secrecy was woven into survival. A man might owe another for grain, a woman might extend credit for cloth. Promises were fragile if left to memory alone, so merchants invented systems marks, scratched on tablets, signs inked onto scraps of parchment, even pebbles arranged in patterns to stand for debts. These private languages were not meant to deceive, but to hold trust, to ensure that exchanges continued fairly in a world where coins were few and memory alone might fail. The noise of trade made the background. You could hear the clink of coins when they did appear, the hollow thump of a mallet striking a cask to show it was sound, the clatter of wooden wheels as a cart nudged through the crowd. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, a child laughed as he tried to steal a plum. Yet within this ordinary commotion, merchants carried their own careful order. They remembered who owed what, but more than memory, they wrote it down, or rather, they marked it down in symbols that made sense to them, and to them alone. A baker might scratch a line into the edge of his stall each time a villager promised to pay later. A weaver might keep a cord with knots tied in places that each stood for a measure of wool owed. A moneylender might use small tablets of wax, pressing numbers with a stylus that could later be smoothed and rewritten. To the casual passerby, these were nothing more than ordinary marks. To those who knew, they were the quiet machinery of trade, as necessary as the bread itself. It is easy to think of secrecy as the concern only of kings and courts, but in truth, secrecy existed in humble places too. When a market woman marked her ledger with a symbol only she understood, she was participating in the same fascination with hidden meaning that entertained the king in his palace. Her secrecy was practical, not political. Yet the echo was there, a shared human delight in the power of signs. The market had its own atmosphere of trust and caution. Voices were not always loud. Sometimes bargains were whispered, heads bent, close, words lost in the general hum. A buyer might place a hand briefly over a seller's to signal sincerity. A merchant might raise two fingers in a gesture that meant not peace, but price. It was a world where meaning moved as much through gesture and sign as through speech. The stalls themselves became records of these transactions. Chalk marks stained wooden planks, tally sticks bore notches cut into them, each one a silent witness to an agreement made. When debts were settled, the sticks were broken in two, each party keeping half his proof. Even broken wood, simple and rough, became a kind of archive, a code of trust. We might imagine a king pausing in such a place, amused or perhaps intrigued. He, who hid meanings in elaborate ciphers, might smile to see that his subjects played their own small games with secrecy. He might note how a simple scratch on wood could carry as much weight, in its way, as the wax-sealed letters carried by his messengers. In both cases, meaning traveled, not openly, but veiled, understood by some, hidden from others. The colors of the market were bright, yet behind them lay these quieter shades of order. Bolts of cloth dyed with woad or madder hung in rich blues and reds. Fruit glistened in baskets, their skins catching the light. Yet beneath the surface shimmer of trade, there was always calculation. How many pennies owed? How many measures? Promised how many days until payment? These questions whispered like undertones beneath the chatter. It is tempting to imagine markets only as noisy, chaotic spaces, but there was rhythm here too. Just as the scriptorium had its scratch of quills, the market had its clink of coins, its shuffle of feet, its soft scratching of chalk. The two worlds, though different, were not opposed. Both were ways of making order. Both turned the machinacies of life into patterns. Letters on parchment, marks on wood, symbols in wax. Both reflected the human need to capture meaning, to preserve it, to keep it from slipping away. Merchants, unlike monks, were not cloistered. They moved, they traveled, they carried stories as well as goods. With them, their private marks traveled, too. A tally system used in one village might appear in another. A secret symbol for paid in full might be passed from father to son, enduring long after the original debt was forgotten. In this way, the market's language of secrecy spread, subtle yet enduring, shaping the flow of trade. The market also reflected trust. A man might hand over bread with only a mark on a stick, as promise. A woman might part with her cloth knowing she would not see payment until harvest. These exchanges were fragile, but the marks held them together. Without these signs, trade might falter, suspicion might rise. With them, the flow of goods continued, and life was sustained. As evening fell, the marketplace changed. Stalls were packed, goods gathered, chalk rubbed away, yet the marks lingered, carried home in ledgers, in tally sticks, in memory reinforced by sin. The market grew quieter, but its language did not vanish. It continued into households, into barns, into workshops where debts and promises remained, alive until the next gathering. And so, while the market was noisier than the scriptorium, it carried its own hush, its own hidden order, the whispers of merchants, the private marks on wood and parchment, the gestures that passed between hands. These belonged to the same fascination that touched kings in their halls, the love of secrecy, of hidden meaning, of symbols that say more than they show. What lingers most is not the noise, but the quiet beneath it, the quiet of trust, written in chalk, the quiet of promises, knotted in cord, the quiet of debts carried, in silence until they were paid. These whispers of the market endure, soft as the scratch of quills, gentle as the rustle of cloth, carrying with them the steady heartbeat of everyday life. Night came slowly in the Middle Ages, without the quick flick of switches or the steady glow of street lamps. The arrival of darkness was more gradual, like a tide that seeped into the streets and fields, filling corners with shadows until the world belonged to the stars. The river, flowing past towns and villages, reflected this dimming light in its waters. At first, it caught the last pale gold of the sun, then the deepening blue of twilight, and finally the silver shimmer of the moon. It was along these rivers that lanterns began to glow. soft halos of fire bobbing and swaying with the current, small human lights against the vast silence of the night. The lanterns were simple things. A wooden frame, a covering of horn scraped thin until it became translucent, or sometimes oiled parchment stretched taut, and within, a flame that flickered and whispered. These lanterns served many purposes. Some were tied to boats, guiding them safely down the waterways. Others hung from poles along bridges or quays, offering reassurance to those who walked home at late hours. Yet, beyond their ordinary use, they sometimes carried hidden roles. A certain number of lanterns tied in a certain pattern could signal a message. The placement of one on the left side of a boat, rather than the right, might mean something only. A few new light itself could be turned into a code, drifting quietly across the water. For medieval towns, rivers were lifelines. Roads could be muddy, narrow, or dangerous, but rivers were steady and strong. Grain moved downstream in barges, timber floated in rafts, fish were hauled in baskets, wine was carried in barrels, and cloth in bales. Yet with the goods came information, for where people traveled, words traveled to fishermen shared news of weather and harvests. Boatmen repeated stories from villages upstream, and sometimes, tucked among these ordinary flows, were messages meant for specific eyes alone. A sealed letter tied beneath a bench, a symbol chalked on a barrel, a lantern raised high at midnight as a sign to watchful eyes across the water. The king, standing at a balcony overlooking the river, might have thought of this often. To him, the water was not just a shimmering surface reflecting moonlight, it was a channel of meaning. Just as the current moved ceaselessly, so too did information. Orders could travel with cargo, reports could move with fishermen, secrets could slip between barges as quietly as fish beneath the surface, and all of it, though unseen, shaped the rhythms of his rule. The sound of the river at night was gentle but persistent, oars dipping in water, ropes creaking as they stretched and tightened, the splash of fish breaking the surface. Occasionally, a low murmur of voices carried across, softer than the rustle of wind in reeds. Those who lived near rivers grew used to these sounds, so much so that silence would have seemed strange. Lantern light added another layer. From a distance, it was a line of faint stars upon the water, each one wavering, reflecting, multiplying, until the river seemed alive with floating fire. Merchants relied on these lanterns to keep track of their cargo. A boat loaded with grain might display 3 lanterns, while one with barrels of ale might display 2. Over time, these practical signals took on further meanings. Just as the tally marks of markets grew into their own quiet codes, so did the lights along the river. Boatmen, often illiterate, relied on systems of recognition that could be understood without words. A particular flicker, the covering of a lantern for a moment, the lifting of one higher than the others, all these could carry meaning. It is tempting to imagine grand conspiracies, secret orders carried in flame, but the reality was gentler, more everyday. A boatman signaling that his vessel carried fish for the early market, a miller arranging to collect grain, a ferryman showing he was ready to cross, even at night. These small, practical exchanges wove themselves into the larger fabric of medieval life. They were not dramatic, yet they mattered, for they allowed trade and travel to continue after sunset, giving the river a life of its own beneath the moon. Still, kings and their advisors understood the possibilities. If a fisherman could send a message to another with a lantern, then surely so too could spies and messengers. Just as the rhythm of oars might carry grain, so too might it carry instructions. And so, secrecy found its place among the lanterns. A single flame, placed deliberately, could mean more than any shouted word. To those who did not know, it was only a light on the water. To those who understood, it was a signal that carried weight. The smell of the river was distinct, damp earth from its banks, the faint sweetness of reeds, sometimes the sharper odor of fish drying in baskets nearby. Mixed with these scents was the smell of smoke from the lanterns themselves, attempts of burning oil or resin, drifting lightly in the air. The senses were always alive at the water's edge. The cool dampness of mists settling on skin, the touch of wood worn smooth by countless hands pulling ropes, the taste of air heavy with moisture, as if the river itself seeped into every breath. These details made the nights unforgettable to those who lived them. The river also brought reflection, both literal and figurative. To watch the moon mirrored on the surface was to see the world doubled, the sky within reach of one's hand. Kings, priests and commoners alike could be lulled into thought by this sight. Perhaps a king, gazing from his balcony, might think of how his words, once spoken, rippled outward like water disturbed by a stone. The ripple might be small at first, but soon it spread wider, touching shores unseen. In this way, messages resembled rivers, continuous, flowing, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always moving forward. Fishermen, rowing home late, knew the river's moods. They knew where currents quickened, where weeds tangled, where sandbars shifted silently beneath the surface. Their lives depended on this knowledge, but it also gave them a closeness to the water that others lacked. For them, lanterns were not only signals, they were companions, small guardians in the dark. The soft glow calmed fears of unseen dangers, both real and imagined. Shadows could seem less threatening when softened by a circle of light. Villagers, too, watched the lanterns. From their cottages along the banks, they saw them drift by, steady and slow. To a child, the sight might seem magical, as though stars had fallen into the water and floated past their window. To an elder, it was reassurance, proof that life continued, that goods would arrive, that tomorrow's bread or fish was already on its way. These quiet observations wove the river into the rhythm of sleep, just as the tolling of a church bell marked the hours of day. Rivers carried more than goods and news, they carried time itself. Seasons flowed along them as clearly as water. Spring brought floods that filled the banks. Summer carried barges heavy with grain. Autumn filled them with timber and wine, and winter froze them into stillness. Lanterns followed these rhythms too. In summer, they glowed late into the night, guiding long journeys. In winter, they appeared only briefly, small flickers in the early dark. Each lantern, though ordinary, became part of the great wheel of the year, reminding people that life, like the river, moved in endless cycles. And always, secrecy lingered in the background. Not in a dramatic sense, but in the quiet way that humans have always hidden and revealed meaning. A flicker of light, a tilt of flame, a boat moving silently past at an unusual hour. These could all be noticed by those attuned. To others, they were invisible, as ordinary as the moon above. This dual nature, ordinary for some, meaningful for others, is what made the lanterns part of the larger story of hidden codes in medieval life. When the night deepened and the river grew darker, the lanterns seemed brighter. They reflected not only in the water, but in the imagination. They became symbols of continuity, of quiet endurance. Just as monks scratched letters and merchants carved marks into wood, so too did riverfolk send their small messages with light. Each mark, each sign, each flicker different in form, but alike in spirit. Together, they formed the gentle network of meaning that sustained life beneath crowns and banners. By the time dawn approached, the lanterns would fade. Flames guttered, oil burned low, and the first grey light of morning dissolved the need for artificial stars upon the river. Barges docked, fishermen carried baskets to market, ferrymen rested their poles. Yet even as daylight erased the glow, the memory of the lanterns remained. They lingered in the mind, like dreams upon waking, soft traces of a night when the river itself seemed alive with fire. And in this way, the river, its lanterns, its sounds, its coded possibilities remained not only a lifeline of goods, but also of thought. For kings, for merchants, for villagers, it whispered the same truth. Meaning moves quietly, like water, shaping the world even when unseen. To step into a medieval building is to step into a world where stone and wood carried not only weight, but also meaning. Cathedrals, castles, halls, and bridges all stood as testaments to human hands that shaped raw earth into form. Yet if one looked closely, beyond the soaring arches or heavy beams, there were smaller details, marks and symbols, scratches and carvings that seemed to whisper of hidden messages. These were not always secrets in the dramatic sense of spies and conspiracies. More often, they were humble masons' marks, or quiet signs of pride, or patterns meant to keep memory. Still, to the eye of a king fascinated by codes, these carvings might seem like a language waiting to be read. The stonemasons who shaped cathedral blocks worked slowly and steadily. Each stone, quarried from hillsides and riverbanks, was cut, smoothed, and lifted into place with great care. Yet before it was set into a wall, the mason often left a mark. Sometimes it was a simple cross or star, sometimes a curved line, a symbol resembling a letter or a small geometric design. These marks helped builders keep track of their work. Each mason could be paid by the number of stones he had cut, and so his mark was his proof. But over time, these symbols took on a life of their own. To later eyes, they seemed mysterious, as though they carried a secret knowledge locked within the walls themselves. In grand cathedrals, where sunlight streamed through colored glass and turned stone into a kaleidoscope of color, such marks might go unnoticed by worshippers. Yet for those who searched carefully, they could be found low near the base, high in the vaults, tucked into the curve of an arch. To the masons, they were practical. To the king or scholar, they could be read as puzzles, signs of hidden meaning placed deliberately into holy places. In truth, they were both. A practical system can, over time, gain symbolic weight, and even the humblest scratch can begin to feel like a code when surrounded by grandeur. Wood too carried such marks. In the beams of great halls, carpenters sometimes carved small patterns before fitting timbers together. These served as guides, ensuring that pieces joined correctly when raised into place. Yet even these functional symbols could appear cryptic, especially centuries later when their original purpose was forgotten. A zigzag, a circle, or a pair of crossed lines, such things, seen in dim light upon an ancient beam, might stir the imagination. Was this a code, a charm, a sign for those who knew? Kings, who were always attuned to symbols of power, might have encouraged their builders to use certain motifs, blending architecture with suggestion of mystery. Walking through a medieval hall, one might feel this layering of craft and meaning. The stones themselves were cool and solid, their surfaces carrying the faint ridges of tools long gone. The beams above were darkened by centuries of smoke, their carved marks softened by time, but still visible if the eye adjusted. Here a circle, there a cross, further on a faint spiral. Each one, though made for practical reasons, seemed to speak in silence. The hall became not only a place of gathering, but also a text, its words written in stone and wood rather than parchment. The atmosphere of such spaces was hushed, even when filled with people. The very weight of stone encouraged quiet. Feet echoed softly on flagstones, and the flicker of torches cast shifting shadows that made carvings seem alive. A king might sit in such a hall, the patterns above him and around him feeding his thoughts. If he believed in codes, then surely these marks were part of that hidden world. Perhaps they were left by ancient builders with wisdom to pass down. Perhaps they held a geometry that reflected divine order. Perhaps they were symbols of guilds whose knowledge stretched across borders. Whatever their origins, they invited contemplation, a quiet fascination that never quite faded. For the masons and carpenters themselves, pride was always part of the work. To leave a mark was to say, I was here, I shaped this stone, I raised this beam. These small signs, often unnoticed by lords and bishops, were a craftsman's way of entering history. They knew the buildings would stand long after their own lives ended. Their names might not be written in books, but their mark would remain hidden, yet enduring. It was a quiet immortality, carved in strokes of chisel and knife. In some cases, the marks served as charms. Builders believed in forces unseen, and many feared evil that might creep into sacred spaces. To carve a symbol, an interlacing knot, a star, or even a simple repeated line was to guard against harm. These were called apotropaic marks, meant to turn away bad fortune. Kings, aware of such beliefs, sometimes requested certain symbols to be placed in their halls. To the casual observer, they looked decorative or random. To those who believed, they were protection, a code against ill will carried in the very stones of the building. Castles to bore such marks. In the thick walls of keeps, where narrow windows let in little light, the stone carried symbols left by the men who had raised them. These marks, repeated through different castles, created a hidden network of recognition. A mason who had worked in one place might find his own mark in another, a silent link across distance. Kings who noticed this might feel reassured, sensing continuity in the hands that built their strongholds. A code of craft, loyal and steady, binding together the stones of power. The slow labor of building created time for reflection. Day after day, chisels struck, hammers rang, saws rasped. The rhythm was steady, like prayer. Within this rhythm, symbols emerged naturally. A mark carved on a stone was not only practical, but also meditative, a pause in the routine, a way of leaving oneself in the work. To walk centuries later among these marks is to sense that rhythm still, faint but present, echoing in silence. Kings, who delighted in codes, might have asked their builders for more than function. A hall arranged so beams formed a certain pattern, a floor of tiles laid in geometric design, a chapel whose proportions reflected holy numbers. These patterns, to the king, suggested order and control, a mirror of the way he wished his rule to be. For him, architecture itself became a kind of code, carrying meaning not in words but in shapes. To stand in such a place was to be surrounded by hidden messages, quiet and enduring. The materials themselves seemed to encourage this. Stone carried permanence, weight, and patience. Wood carried warmth, flexibility, and life. Both responded well to carving. A chisel could turn hard rock into a surface of meaning. A knife could turn a timber into a bearer of signs. Light, moving across these surfaces, deepened the effect. Shadows played in grooves, making lines shift as the day passed. A code carved in stone was not static, it lived with the sun, changing from morning to dusk, reminding those who looked that meaning can shift with time. To the villagers who walked beneath cathedral walls or passed through castle gates, the marks might have gone unnoticed, or else they seemed decorative, part of the building's skin. Yet occasionally someone might pause, tracing a shape with a fingertip, wondering, was it only a builder's pride? Was it a message? Was it a charm? The ambiguity itself gave power. A mark whose meaning is forgotten becomes a mystery, and mystery always invites reverence. In this way, buildings themselves became texts, read differently by different eyes. To the mason, they were work and wage. To the villager, they were awe and safety. To the king, they were codes, signs that reflected his own fascination with hidden meaning. Stone and wood thus carried layers of interpretation, none excluding the others, all existing together in quiet harmony. As night fell in such places, the atmosphere deepened, torches flickered, their smoke rising toward carved beams. The marks upon those beams seemed to watch, faint scratches glowing briefly in shifting light. Walls, touched by shadow, revealed their symbols only to those who looked closely. The silence of stone at night was profound, broken only by distant footsteps or the creak of timber settling. To lie awake within such walls was to feel surrounded by presence not ghostly, but human. The presence of those who had carved, built, and left their signs behind. Over centuries, these marks endured, whether war at stone, smoke-darkened beams, yet the carvings remained, softened but not erased. Each generation looked upon them differently. Some saw craft, some saw code, some saw blessing. Kings who passed through their halls often paused, fingers brushing symbols, minds turning toward hidden meanings. They found comfort in the idea that their buildings spoke a language, one not easily understood, but always present, like the whisper of the past carried forward. In the end, codes in stone and wood were not separate from life, they were part of it. They held the pride of workers, the caution of superstition, the fascination of rulers. They gave buildings a voice, silent yet eloquent, patient yet enduring. To walk among them today is to hear that voice, still, soft as the echo of chisels long gone, steady as the grain of wood. It is to know that meaning does not fade easily when carved into the very fabric of a place. And so the medieval world was filled with such signs, waiting quietly on walls and beams, bridges and doors. Each one small, each one simple, yet together forming a language of craft and mystery. A language that kings read as codes, that builders read as wages, that villagers read as blessings. A language carved not on parchment, but in the lasting strength of stone and wood. Winter in the medieval world was a season of stillness, when nature itself seemed to pause beneath blankets of snow and silence. Roads grew difficult, rivers froze, fields lay bare, work slowed, and people retreated indoors, gathering around firelight for warmth and companionship. The hearth became not only a source of heat, but also a center of life, drawing families, servants, and guests into its steady glow. In castles and cottages alike, fire softened the harshness of cold months, transforming long nights into spaces of quiet gathering. Within these hours, words both spoken and written carried special weight. Stories, songs, prayers, and sometimes codes passed from lips to parchment, all under the watchful dance of flames. The king's court, though larger and more elaborate, followed the same instinct as humble homes. As winter tightened its grip, Courtiers and attendants drew near the great hearths that blazed in stone halls. Logs were stacked high, each one chosen from the king's forests, seasoned and split to burn hot against the chill. Sparks crackled upward into chimneys, sending faint trails of smoke out into the frozen night. Shadows lengthened on the walls, rising and falling as flames shifted. It was within this atmosphere of warmth and enclosure that codes so precious to kings who treasured secrecy were studied, written, or unraveled. The pace of such evenings was unhurried. Outside, snow, muffled sound, softening the world into silence. Inside, voices rarely rose above murmurs. Courtiers bent close to one another, speaking in hushed tones, their words private yet intimate. Scribes, seated at heavy tables, dipped quills into ink and let them glide across parchment. The scratching was faint yet steady, a counterpoint to the crackle of burning logs. To watch the creation of a code in such a setting was to see patience embodied, letter by letter, symbol by symbol. Meaning was hidden within patterns. The process was not frantic, not hurried. It was as deliberate as embroidery, the needle of the quill stitching secret designs upon vellum. For the king, winter evenings offered both rest and reflection. The duties of ruling did not end with snow, but the pace changed. Campaigns ceased, hunts grew rarer, and travel slowed. The court gathered more often indoors, in chambers lined with tapestries to keep out drafts. The king would sit near the hearth, sometimes in silence, sometimes in quiet conversation. In those moments of stillness, his fascination with codes often deepened. For if summer was a time for action, winter was a time for thought, and codes belonged to thought. They required patience, contemplation, and the kind of attention made possible by long firelit nights. The hearth itself seemed to encourage secrecy. Flames cast a shifting light that revealed some things while hiding others. A face could be half in brightness, half in shadow, lending an air of mystery to conversation. Words spoken by the fire might be remembered differently, softened, transformed by the play of light and heat. It was easy to imagine that in such a setting, the very walls might keep secrets, that the fire itself might guard confidences whispered within its glow. Kings and courtiers, ever mindful of trust and betrayal, found comfort in the intimacy of the hearth, where codes could be discussed quietly, away from the harsher scrutiny of public halls. In the villages beyond the castle, winter evenings were quieter still. Families gathered in single-room cottages, huddled close to small fires. Children dozed on benches or curled beside dogs, while elders told stories to pass the time. Even here, small secrets circulated. Lovers passed tokens, merchants kept tallies, shepherds carved marks into sticks. Codes, in their simplest forms, warmed these nights too, though less for statecraft than for play or memory. What united both king and peasant was the rhythm of winter, the slowing of life, the turning inward, the reliance on firelight as both warmth and companion. In noble halls, however, the codes crafted by scribes took on greater gravity. A cipher might protect the king's commands, guarding them from spies. A secret message might pass between allies, its words hidden within patterns of numbers or letters. The creation of such messages by firelight added to their sense of intimacy. The very act of writing, with ink glistening in the glow, carried a sense of ritual. Those who participated often felt they were part of something larger than themselves, hidden thread in the great tapestry of power. Fire itself seemed to mirror this work. Just as letters danced into symbols, flames leaped and curled, forming shapes that lasted only a moment before dissolving into smoke. Both fire and code were fleeting. Both required attention. Both carried meaning beyond their surface. A scribe might glance into the flames after finishing a line, seeing in their restless patterns an echo of the secrets just committed to parchment. A king might watch sparks rise, comparing them in his mind to hidden words, traveling into the night, vanishing quickly but carrying weight as they went. The soundscape of such evenings was gentle. The fire popped softly, pages turned with a faint rustle, ink dried with a subtle shine. Courtiers whispered, and sometimes laughter broke through, light and brief before fading again. Occasionally, a musician might play a lute or harp in the background, filling the hall with notes that seemed to weave into the fire's rhythm. These sounds together formed a kind of music of winter evenings, not lively, not hurried, but steady, calming, and reflective. Within that atmosphere, codes seemed to belong naturally, their hidden rhythms echoing the measured pace of life. By the hearth, Even the act of solving a code was shaped by the hearth's presence. Courtiers tasked with deciphering messages often leaned close to the fire, warming hands as they bent over parchment. Their brows furrowed, eyes narrowed, lips moved silently as they tested patterns and guessed at hidden words. The flickering firelight gave their faces a look of concentration, shadows deepening the furrows, brightening the glances of sudden insight. To crack a code by firelight was to feel a double warmth, the heat of flame and the glow of discovery. For the king, these long evenings held something almost meditative. Codes appealed not only to his need for secrecy, but also to his desire for order. In the chaos of winter storms, with winds howling at shutters and snow piling high against gates, the careful logic of codes offered reassurance. Here, in symbols and substitutions, was a world that obeyed rules. Here, meaning could be hidden and revealed by reason. The fire roared, the night deepened, but the parchment in his hand carried a structure that could be trusted. It was both game and safeguard, both diversion and defense. The hearth also served as a place of teaching. Princes and princesses, young and curious, might be invited to watch scribes at work. They learned letters, numbers, and the art of careful attention. To a child, the flicker of fire and the slow appearance of symbols on parchment seemed magical. They whispered questions, their voices barely rising above the crackle of logs. In this way, knowledge passed quietly across generations, nurtured not in classrooms but in warm corners of winter halls. Codes, like stories, became part of the inheritance of rule, shaped in the glow of hearthlight. Outside, the world lay silent under frost. Trees stood bare, their branches etched against the pale moon. Animals slept in barns, wrapped in straw. Snow covered roofs and fields alike, muting every sound. The stillness of the season made the warmth of the hearth feel deeper, more precious. To step outside, even briefly, was to feel the sting of icy air, the crunch of frozen ground, the hush of a world at rest. To step back inside was to be greeted by glow and murmur, by codes half written and conversations half finished, waiting patiently by the fireside. In such contrast, the secretive work of codes took on added weight. Messages written in the warmth of the hearth would travel out into that frozen stillness, carried by trusted messengers through the dangers of winter roads. The thought itself added to the fire's comfort, for within the hall, in the glow of flame, one felt secure. But beyond the gates lay uncertainties, snowdrifts, bandits, spies, and the endless cold. Codes were a way of keeping control over that uncertainty, of sending words safely even into the harshest season. Over time, memories of such evenings lingered. Those who had sat by the fire recalled not only warmth and companionship, but also the steady labor of writing, reading, and guarding secrets. They remembered the glow on parchment, the hush of voices, the sense that meaning could be hidden within patterns as easily as warmth was hidden within logs. Kings especially held on to these images, seeing in them symbols of their own rule. Fire that gave warmth, codes that gave order, both fragile yet enduring, both needing care to keep alive. As the winter night stretched long, some slept by the hearth, lulled by its steady rhythm. Others stayed awake, watching embers fade to deep red, adding another log when needed. The final hours before dawn were the quietest of all. Flames grew low, symbols lay finished on parchment, courtiers whispered less. The hall seemed to breathe slowly, resting. And in that rest, the meaning of codes seemed clearest, not just as tools of secrecy, but as companions to thought, reflections of the slow, steady rhythm of winter life itself. Thus, winter evenings by the hearth were more than moments of comfort. They were laboratories of patience, where kings and scribes wove patterns of secrecy beneath the watchful glow of fire. They were also sanctuaries, where families and servants alike found refuge from cold and dark. In their warmth, codes were not only crafted, but also cherished, their hidden words warming the mind, just as mulled wine warmed the body. Outside, frost reigned. Inside, fire and thought held sway together. And when spring finally returned, when snows melted and rivers ran free again, the memory of those winter evenings lingered. They reminded kings that power was not always won by sword or decree. Sometimes it was kept alive in symbols written slowly by firelight, in secrets preserved through patience, in the quiet companionship of flame and parchment. The hearth, in its steady glow, had been both teacher and guardian, shaping not only warmth but also wisdom. Within the heart of many medieval palaces, behind thick walls and beneath heavy beams of oak, there sometimes lay a quieter chamber, a place set apart from the noise of feasting halls and the weight of daily rule. This was the library, though in those days the word itself felt almost too grand. For kings and nobles, it was not a vast collection as we imagine today, with endless rows of shelves, but rather a modest, guarded treasury of books. Each book was precious, each page a labor of many hours, sometimes many months, copied by the careful hand of scribes and bound in leather that grew supple and worn through touch. To step into such a room was to step into a kind of garden, but instead of flowers and vines, it was filled with volumes of wisdom, knowledge, and secrets waiting to be found. The air of these rooms was different from the rest of the castle. Cold stone seemed softened by the presence of so many books. The faint smell of vellum and parchment, of ink that had dried years before, mixed with the scent of polished wood and the faint traces of beeswax from the candles that lit the space. When a king entered this room, the sound of his steps echoed gently against the floor, softened by the presence of leather spines and the tapestries that sometimes hung to keep the chamber warmer. It was not silence, but a hushed quiet that seemed to welcome reflection. One might hear only the soft creak of a chair as someone settled to read, or the subtle sound of a page being turned. These were not loud noises, but they carried meaning, like the slow breathing of a living space. For kings, such libraries were more than collections of books. They were sanctuaries. Here, away from the watchful eyes of courtiers and the endless petitions of nobles, a king could wander among volumes that stretched far beyond the reach of his kingdom. A book on herbal remedies might open 2 pages where plants were drawn carefully in faded ink, their roots and leaves explained with both caution and care. Another might contain psalms and prayers, their letters illuminated in gold that caught the faint flicker of candlelight. And then, tucked within the margins of a text or hidden between the lines, there might be a curious cipher, a code or symbol placed there by some earlier hand. To discover such a mark was to feel the spark of mystery. For a man who ruled, surrounded by ceremony and order, the possibility of hidden words gave a new layer of fascination. The act of reading itself was a kind of escape. Books in the medieval world were not casual things. They were weighty, bound tightly, sometimes with clasps, to protect their fragile pages. To open one required intention, as if performing a ritual. A king might lay the book upon a lectern or heavy table, open the cover, and slowly spread the pages, feeling the texture beneath his fingertips. Each turn was deliberate, each line of text an invitation to pause. Reading in such a room was never hurried. It was done in the slow rhythm of winter evenings, with time stretching wide. Each word or phrase savored like a sip of mulled wine. The library was not always large, but it felt boundless in its quiet promise. Some kings compared the presence of books to the presence of gardens, where one garden bloomed with roses, another bloomed with knowledge. Each book was like a bed of flowers, each word like a leaf, each cipher like a hidden seed waiting to grow. In the mind of its reader, a secret garden of books, in truth, was a place of cultivation. What was grown here was not fruit or grain, but thought and imagination, the nourishment of the inner life. It is easy to imagine a king, restless from duties of judgment and diplomacy, retreating to this private chamber at dusk. Outside, the castle quieted as servants settled into their routines, as soldiers dozed in guardhouses, as kitchens cooled after fires were banked. Within the library, however, time felt suspended. The king might take a candle in hand, let its small flame light the spines of the volumes before him, and choose a book that promised rest or stimulation. Perhaps it was a book of scripture, its passages familiar yet always new. Perhaps it was a herbal compendium, useful for the health of his household. Or perhaps it was something rarer, book filled with patterns, geometric drawings, or letters that hinted at more than they said. For kings fascinated with codes, the library was both inspiration and workshop. Here they could study the works of others, compare methods of writing, and even leave their own marks in margins. Some kings enjoyed crafting personal symbols, signatures, or ciphers to be used in correspondence. To place such marks within a book was like planting a hidden flower in their secret garden, one that might not bloom until many years later, when another hand discovered it. These acts were small, almost playful, yet they reflected a deeper truth, the hunger for control over meaning, for the ability to guard secrets and reveal them only to those chosen. The stillness of the library also fed the imagination. Shadows from candle flames played along the spines of books, turning ordinary objects into mysterious shapes. The flicker of light upon a gilded letter could make it seem alive. A book closed with its clasps tight could feel like a locked chest, guarding treasure within. To sit in such a space was to feel that the room itself held mysteries. That knowledge was always both present and hidden, waiting for the careful eye. Kings were not always alone in these spaces. Trusted scribes or clerics might accompany them, assisting with difficult passages or translating Latin into the language of the court. The soft murmur of these voices added to the atmosphere, a low current of sound, like the hum of bees in summer gardens, a scribe's finger tracing a line, a monk's patient explanation of a phrase. The king's thoughtful nod. These moments built a shared intimacy, a bond between ruler and servant, forged not in battle but in learning. In such quiet companionship, codes and secrets often took root, nurtured by both curiosity and trust. Beyond the practical uses of books, their presence carried a weight of symbolism. A king with a library signaled not only wealth, but also wisdom. Books were expensive, requiring time, skill, and resources to create. To own many was to demonstrate refinement, to show that one valued knowledge alongside power. Yet for the king himself, the meaning was more personal. A book was a companion in solitude, a silent advisor whose words could be revisited time and again. In moments of uncertainty, a passage of scripture might soothe. In moments of intrigue, a cipher might sharpen the mind. The library was a treasury, not of gold, but of thoughts, and thoughts had their own kind of power. The passage of seasons also shaped how the library was experienced. In summer, windows might be opened to let in the scent of roses and the buzz of bees, the sound of distant fields alive with work. In winter, shutters were closed tight, and the chamber grew colder, lit only by the steady flames of candles or braziers. In those darker months, the contrast between the storm outside and the calm within made the library feel even more like a haven. Snow might pile high against the walls, but within, the king turned a page, hearing only the gentle creak of leather and the soft shuffle of slippers across stone. Over time, the collection of books itself grew into a kind of code. Margins filled with notes, bindings carried marks of ownership, and pages bore signs of use. A small stain of wax, a smudge of ink, a bent corner, each told a story of hands that had touched the book before. For the king, reading these traces was like solving another layer of mystery. Who had read this before him? What thoughts had stirred as they lingered over the same lines? The library became not just a garden of books, but a garden of memories, each volume a pathway into the lives of those who had touched it. And when the king closed a book at last, pressing its cover shut and securing its clasp, the act itself felt like the ending of a ritual. The candle flame might flicker lower, the room might settle once more into stillness, and the king might rise with the sense that he had walked among hidden paths, explored unseen gardens, and spoken with voices long silent. Codes, ciphers, and secrets were not only matters of statecraft, they were threads of imagination, threads woven through the quiet fabric of nights spent in the library's embrace. Thus, the king's secret garden of books was not only a collection of volumes, but a sanctuary of thought. It was a place where the burdens of rule could soften, where the mind could wander slowly, where every page turned was like a step upon a winding path. Within those chambers, time itself seemed to move differently, less like the march of armies, more like the gentle turning of seasons. And for kings who loved codes, it was here, in the stillness of their libraries, that they found a refuge both private and profound, where hidden meanings blossomed quietly like flowers in the shadows. In the dim interiors of medieval chapels, where stone walls met lofty arches and light filtered down in softened beams, sound took on a life of its own. The air inside these sacred spaces was cool, touched with the faint fragrance of incense and beeswax, and heavy with stillness, until the moment voices began to rise. Plainchant, simple, yet profound, filled the space with its slow and steady cadence. It was a sound that seemed less sung than breathed, an exhalation of devotion that moved through the air like mist curling through the trees. To those who prayed, it was worship. To those who listened with a different kind of attention, it was also a pattern, a rhythm woven with intention, perhaps carrying meanings beyond what the words alone revealed. Kings, seated in carved wooden stalls or standing in shadowed galleries, often listened closely to these chants. Their ears, trained by years of counsel, secrecy, and curiosity, caught more than just melody. They heard the repetition of phrases, the rise and fall of voices, the way one tone gave way to another in a structure that seemed deliberate, almost mathematical. For a king fascinated by codes, music itself could feel like a cipher. Notes were not random. They were arranged with care, following hidden rules that gave them power to soothe, to stir, to inspire awe. Listening in such spaces was not only devotion, it was also contemplation of order and meaning. The architecture of chapels magnified this impression. Stone walls echoed sound in long, lingering trails. A single note might hang in the air like a silver thread, weaving into the next until layers of resonance surrounded all who listened. The king, seated in quiet dignity, would feel not only the sound entering his ears, but also the vibration moving through the floor, the benches, the very stones of the chapel itself. Music seemed both everywhere and nowhere, without beginning or end. Much like the hidden messages in codes, where meaning often stretched invisibly beneath the surface of letters. For the monks and clerics who sang, plain chant was daily rhythm, as steady as the rising and setting of the sun. The hours of prayer were marked by song, each moment of the day carried forward by voices rising in devotion. To the king, who observed these practices with reverence, the constancy of chant was striking. Just as codes relied on repetition, substitution, and careful structure, so too did music. It carried forward through time, linking one day to another, one generation to the next. What seemed to many like simple worship could appear, to a mind attuned to secrecy, as another language, one built of tone instead of ink. The harmonies of chant were not elaborate by modern standards. They lacked the complex layering of later compositions, the interplay of many voices weaving intricate webs. Instead, chant was gentle, steady, a single line rising and falling with quiet purpose. Yet it was in this simplicity that kings often sensed depth. The order of notes mirrored the order they sought in governance. The careful balance of sound mirrored the careful balance of rule. Just as a kingdom needed rhythm cycles of tax, harvest, and ceremonies, so too did music. And within its rhythm, they sometimes felt the presence of hidden harmonies, unseen yet deeply felt. At times, a king might close his eyes and allow the sound to carry him. The chants, repeating with patient certainty, had a way of softening the mind, of pulling thought inward. The steady flow of sound was like the flow of script across parchment, each syllable a symbol, each phrase a completed line. To dwell in this sound was to dwell in a different kind of code, one written not in ink but in vibration, one that carried the listener beyond the surface into the heart of order itself. The atmosphere of these chapels deepened the sense of secrecy. Shadows lingered in high corners, candles flickered along narrow shelves, and the faint rustle of robes echoed as singers shifted their stance. It was easy to imagine that within the notes themselves, hidden meanings moved quietly, carried like whispers through the vaulted air. A king fascinated with secret codes could not help but wonder if music, like writing, might contain concealed messages, patterns that spoke to those who knew how to listen. Beyond the chapel, music carried into daily life as well. In courts and villages alike, songs marked festivals, feasts, and rituals. Yet in the sacred plainchant of monasteries, the connection between sound and secrecy was clearest. Kings often patronized monasteries not only for their prayers but also for their knowledge, and music was part of that treasury. The very act of notation, the careful writing of neumes upon parchment, resembled a coded system. Marks above words guided the singer's voice, yet to the untrained, they were little more than mysterious shapes. To a king, the resemblance to ciphers was impossible to ignore. Here was another system of signs, another hidden language. The discipline required to learn and maintain chant was itself a form of devotion. Singers memorized countless lines, their voices trained to hold steady across long hours. This patience mirrored the patience needed to decipher codes. It required attentiveness, humility, and repetition. Kings who valued secrecy saw in these practices a reflection of their own craft. Layers of meaning preserved through careful structure, truth revealed only through persistence. Winter evenings brought chants into sharper relief, when nights stretched long and cold, and snow lay heavy upon cloisters. The sound of voices rising in song filled chapels with warmth that fire alone could not provide. The king, wrapped in fur-lined cloaks, might attend Vespers and hear the echoes weaving through the stone like threads of silver. Each note seemed to shine against the darkness outside, each repetition a candle in sound. In these moments, music became more than devotion or cipher. It became comfort, binding ruler and subject, monk and king, into one shared rhythm. The patterns of chant also carried emotional weight. Where codes often held secrecy, music held feeling. Yet to a king attentive to both, the two were not opposed but complementary. A cipher protected meaning, music expressed it. Together, they shaped a world where words could be hidden, and sound could reveal what silence could not. Listening to plainchant, a king might reflect not only on power and secrecy, but also on the human need for beauty, for order, and for something greater than the self. Even after leaving the chapel, echoes of the chant lingered. They followed in memory, repeating softly as the king returned to his chambers or walked the torchlit halls. The rhythm of his own steps might seem to mirror the rhythm of the music, his breath rising and falling with the remembered cadence. In this way, chant extended beyond its setting, just as codes extended beyond their parchment. Both lived within the mind, shaping thought long after their creation. Thus, patterns in music and chant were more than ritual. They were a reflection of the same human impulse that drove kings to cherish codes, the desire to find order in a shifting world, to discover meaning in repetition, to hold on to secrets both sacred and personal. To sit in the shadows of a chapel, listening as voices blended, was to feel this impulse laid bare. Music, like code, was a mirror of the human mind, mysterious, structured, and filled with hidden harmonies. And when the final notes faded, leaving only silence behind, the chapel seemed transformed. The echoes still hummed in the stone, and the king still felt their rhythm in his chest. To rise and leave was to carry a fragment of that secret language into the night, a memory of order and mystery that would remain long after the flames of the candles had gone out. The turning of the seasons was the most dependable rhythm of the medieval world, a cycle that arrived without fail, shaping the lives of peasants and kings alike. Long before clocks or calendars ordered daily existence, it was the shifting light of dawn and dusk, the feel of air upon the skin, the scent of soil or frost, that marked time's slow procession. For a medieval king, whose authority was bound to the fertility of fields, the abundance of harvests, and the endurance of his people through winters, the seasons were not only natural forces, but also texts to be read. They were the great language of the earth, speaking in frost and blossom, in drought and flood, in abundance and famine. Those kings who delighted in puzzles and codes often looked upon these cycles as if they were riddles written in the landscape, each change concealing as much as it revealed. Each turn of the year a cipher whose message could be studied but never fully grasped. Winter came first in this cycle of meditation, for it was the season that pressed itself most forcefully upon the senses. The deep silences of snow, the wayfields lay barren under pale skies, and the crisp bite of air all worked to hush the land into stillness. Villagers huddled in cottages, their work reduced to mending tools, preserving food, and telling stories. By firelight for a king, winter was a season of reflection. Outdoor labor slowed, and the court itself grew quieter, gatherings shrinking to the warmth of hearths. In this silence, codes and ciphers often came to life. As the land concealed its vitality under snow and frost, so too did hidden words conceal meanings beneath their surface. Winter, in its austerity, became a metaphor for secrecy, the outward barrenness that hid an inward store of life. Just as seeds slept beneath frozen soil, so too did secrets rest beneath symbols waiting to be unlocked. Spring arrived as release, and with it the first signs of renewal. Green shoots pierced through thawing earth, rivers loosened their icy grip and tumbled in rushing streams, and birds returned with songs that filled the morning air. To farmers, spring was instruction. Prepare, sow, trust in the earth's promise. To kings, it was revelation, a season that unfolded like a hidden message suddenly brought to light. Where winter had concealed, spring revealed, displaying the underlying order of life. Fields once blank were now written with furrows, lines stretching in careful parallel across the soil, as if the earth itself had become parchment. Farmers read these signs attentively, noting the weather, gauging the growth, each observation as careful and meaningful as the stroke of a scribe's quill. For kings who watched from above, the work of sowing and tending seemed like the deciphering of nature's text, a process slow, uncertain, yet filled with trust in an ultimate meaning. Summer stretched long and golden, heavy with growth and labor. The days seemed to expand, light lingering into the evening, and every village hummed with activity. The steady rhythm of scythes moving through fields, the turning of hay, the tending of animals, all gave the impression of music, a chant of labor rising from the land itself. Kings looked upon these months with both satisfaction and caution. A good summer promised abundance, a poor one threatened hunger and unrest. Yet in the grand design of seasons, summer was the season of accumulation, when the hidden patterns of spring growth became visible in full. Grain heads bent heavy on their stalks, orchards swelled with fruit, and the land displayed its code of fertility openly. The king, attuned to hidden orders, might see summer as a cipher temporarily laid bare, its message clear. The earth could be generous, but it demanded labor, patience, and faith. Then came autumn, a season of gathering and of endings. Fields, once green, turned gold and brown, their richness harvested and stored. Villages filled barns with grain, salted meat for the cold months ahead, and pressed apples into cider. Smoke rose from hearths as families prepared to retreat once more into winter's silence. For kings, autumn was the reckoning season, the final line of the year's text, the summing of all that had been sown and grown. The language of nature here was final and decisive. If the harvest was plentiful, the kingdom would thrive. If poor, discontent might stir. Yet beyond its practical weight, autumn also spoke in symbols. The falling of leaves, the shortening of days, the cooling of ROL reminded those who observed carefully of cycles, of endings folded into beginnings. Just as a cipher completed its circle when solved, so too did the year draw to completion, preparing for silence once more. This grand turning of seasons was, in its way, a code that no man could fully master. Unlike the ciphers scratched onto parchment or carved into stone, the language of nature was vast, patient, and subtle. Farmers read its signs daily at the height of clouds, the dampness of soil, the call of birds, and their survival depended on interpreting them correctly. Kings, though further removed from the soil, were equally dependent upon these readings. A poor harvest could undo policies, weaken armies, and shake authority more quickly than any foreign plot. Thus, rulers who cherished the mystery of codes often found in the seasons a humbling counterpart. Here was a cipher authored not by human hands but by time itself, vast and inexhaustible. The court's calendar reflected this seasonal language. Festivals and feasts were arranged around solstices and equinoxes, harvests and plantings, with religious observances intertwined to mark each turning. Candlemas lit the darkness of late winter, Easter celebrated spring's renewal, midsummer fires honored the high sun, and Michaelmas closed the harvest. These were not only holy days but also markers in the text of the year, punctuation points that reminded all king, court, and peasant that they lived within a greater pattern. For a monarch fascinated by hidden structures, these recurring feasts were like recurring motifs in a cipher, symbols that bound the year into coherence. Even art and architecture echoed this seasonal awareness. Cathedrals bore carvings of vines, leaves, and harvest scenes, their stone frozen in eternal cycles. Illuminated manuscripts often framed their sacred texts with borders of seasonal imagery, winter fires, spring blossoms, summer fruits, autumn fields, turning each book into a miniature calendar of the earth's rhythms. Kings paging through such volumes might smile at the subtle blending of divine word and natural order, as though God's script extended into every frost and blossom, every grain and leaf. At a more personal level, kings themselves felt the weight of seasons in their bodies and moods. The cold of winter pressed them into reflection. The freshness of spring lifted their spirits. Summer drew them outward into hunts and progresses, while autumn brought a sober recognition of endings. These shifts were not unlike the solving of a cipher, where moods of frustration, insight, and satisfaction all followed in sequence. To live within the seasons was to live within an endless riddle, one that required patience to endure and attention to savor. Nature's language, like any code, also contained ambiguity. A late frost could destroy blossoms, heavy rains could rot grain, drought could wither fields. The messages of the seasons were not always benevolent. They could be warnings as much as promises. Kings who relied upon astrologers and weather watchers knew this well. They sought to read the heavens, to interpret signs in stars and skies, believing that within those distant patterns might lie hints of what the seasons would bring. In this, they extended their fascination with codes beyond parchment and into the cosmos, seeking hidden meaning in every sphere of existence. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of this seasonal language was its constancy. No matter how uncertain harvests or unpredictable weather might be, the cycle itself endured. Winter always gave way to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, and then back to winter. This unbroken turning reassured kings who lived in times of political upheaval and human fragility. Thrones could be lost, battles could be won or squandered, secrets could be betrayed, but the seasons turned faithfully, reminding ruler and subject alike that they lived within a greater order than any they could devise. It was a code not meant to be solved, but to be lived. Thus, in quiet moments of reflection, walking through frosted gardens, riding past budding fields, hunting in summer woods, or watching leaves fall upon castle courtyards, kings found themselves reading the world as if it were a manuscript. Nature's letters were written in snow and blossom, in rain and drought, in harvest and barrenness, and though no one could fully decipher the text, the act of observing, of seeking meaning, was itself enough. It linked them to their people, to the earth, and to the divine. The language of the seasons, patient and profound, was the greatest. Of all medieval ciphers, it required no quill or parchment, no scriptorium or seal. It was written upon the land itself, in a script vast and inexhaustible, endlessly repeating yet never the same. To kings who cherished secrecy, it was a reminder that some codes were not meant to be broken, only honored, and as frost melted, to blossom, as harvests ripened and faded. They lived within this eternal riddle, their lives measured not by crowns alone but by the quiet, enduring rhythm of the turning year. In the quiet world of medieval courts, where the spoken word could fade on the air and be lost within moments, it was the written letter that carried permanence. Letters were the slow pulse of governance, drifting steadily between castle and monastery, between court and cathedral, between king and noble household. They traveled by horseback and by foot, through rain and dust, through the dampness of river mist and the heat of summer fields. Yet beyond the words themselves, these letters carried another language, one written in wax, ribbon, fold, and mark. To receive such a letter was to open not only a page of words, but also a page of symbols, for each detail, each seal pressed into soft wax, each carefully tied ribbon, each crease in the parchment, spoke as surely as any inked sentence. For kings fascinated with hidden codes, these small signals offered a quiet joy, for the letter itself was a cipher before it was ever read. A wax seal was perhaps the most immediate mark of authority. The soft, warmed wax, dripped onto parchment, was pressed by a ring or a stamp, each design carved with care. A seal bore the crest of a house, the emblem of a kingdom, or sometimes a more personal symbol, a fleur-de-lis, a lion, a cross, or even a cluster of stars. To the ordinary recipient, the seal was a guarantee of authenticity. To those initiated into subtler understandings, it could be more. A slight shift in pressure, a crack allowed to form. Even the angle at which the stamp was placed could signal that the message within required special attention. Like the cycles of seasons or the patterns of music, seals offered kings and courtiers alike a secondary language, a way to speak in silence. Ribbons too carried meaning. When parchment was folded and bound, ribbons of silk, linen, or hemp might hold it closed. To tie a ribbon in a certain knot, to twist it in a certain direction, or to dye it a particular color could all serve as quiet instructions. Red silk might suggest urgency, green patience, white trust. A knot tightened twice instead of once might warn of danger. A ribbon tucked beneath a fold rather than across it might imply secrecy. Though not every letter bore such marks, those that did spoke in ways words could not. A king who loved riddles and codes might smile to see a ribbon tied just so, understanding the unspoken before his eyes even reached the written. Even the folding of parchment carried its secrets. Some letters were folded in such a way that they could not be opened without breaking the seal, thus ensuring privacy. Others contained deliberate creases, sharp or shallow, diagonal or straight, that only a few knew how to interpret. A fold placed across the upper margin might indicate the sender wished for the letter to be read in haste. A fold down the side might mean it could wait. These subtleties were part of the rhythm of governance, where silence and signal worked together. a balance between what was seen and what was meant. There were also smudges, stains, and marks, which in their own quiet way became part of the code. A deliberate blot of ink might rest beside a name, its placement intentional, a whisper to the attentive reader. A smear of wax beyond the seal could carry significance. Even the pressure of the quill upon the parchment could change light strokes for formality, heavier strokes for urgency. To most eyes, these were imperfections. To a king trained to notice patterns, they were messages in themselves. Couriers carried these letters as steady vessels of communication. They rode along muddy paths, their horses leaving deep prints in wet soil, or they trudged through snow with letters tucked carefully in pouches, safe from moisture. They stopped at taverns for bread and ale, at monasteries for shelter, at way stations for fresh mounts. Yet through all these journeys, their pace was unhurried. Letters were not expected to fly across kingdoms. They were expected to arrive in time, to carry the rhythm of governance at the same pace as the turning seasons, the same patience as the slow work of scribes in a scriptorium. A king waiting for news knew that time itself was part of the message, that delays were natural. That urgency, though real, must always bend to the limits of distance and terrain. The arrival of a letter in a great hall was itself a moment of quiet ceremony. The courier bowed, presenting the folded parchment with seal and ribbon intact. Hands took it carefully, eyes lingering first on the seal rather than the words. The king or his secretary studied the impression, the fold, the ribbon, and only then broke the wax, lifted the flap, and read. It was as if the letter had two layers, the outer shell of signs and symbols, and the inner core of inked words. Both mattered, both spoke, and for kings fascinated by secrecy, both gave delight to the recognition that meaning might be hidden not only within sentences, but within the very craft of the letter itself. Libraries and treasuries of kings often held collections of letters, kept not only for their words but for their marks. Rolls of parchment tied with faded ribbons, seals broken or intact, folds still creased into their fibers. These were archives of symbols, quiet reminders of past communications. Some kings studied them like puzzles, laying out letters side by side, comparing the thickness of wax, the tilt of impressions, the patterns of knots. To hold such letters was to hold history in layered form, both overt and concealed. The faint smell of wax lingered, the silk of old ribbons softened to threads, the parchment browned with age. Yet the hidden signs remained, as fresh in their mystery as when first sent. The practice of seals, ribbons, and hidden marks was not confined to kings alone. Merchants, too, adopted subtle systems. A mark on the edge of parchment might indicate whether a debt was settled or pending. A ribbon of a certain shade could denote the nature of goods enclosed within an inventory. Even common folk developed signs for personal letters, folding pages in familiar ways that only their family would recognize. The language of hidden marks was, in truth, a quiet inheritance shared across classes, a recognition that human communication always longed for layers, always sought to say more than words alone. In this sense, the royal use of hidden messages was not so different from the farmer reading the sky or the mason leaving his mark on stone. All were forms of codes, patterns placed into the world to carry meaning beyond the obvious. A king pressing his seal into wax was not unlike a stonemason carving his emblem into a block. Both left behind a sign of presence, of authorship, of trust. Both created meaning that outlived the moment of making. Both spoke silently to those who knew how to read. Yet the beauty of these messages lay in their subtlety. They were never meant to dazzle or confuse. They were meant to reassure, to affirm, to guide quietly. A letter bearing the king's seal calmed a restless village, proving that authority watched over them. A ribbon tied in a certain knot reassured a noble ally that trust remained intact. A fold creased in a particular way reminded a scribe that haste was required. These signals did not shout, they whispered. They did not overwhelm, they soothed, and in this softness, they became a reflection of governance itself, not the loud clash of battle or the dramatic proclamation, but the steady hum of order, carried forward letter by letter, sign by sign. As evening descended on a medieval court, and lanterns flickered along stone corridors, letters might be read aloud in quiet chambers, the crack of wax being broken, the gentle rustle of parchment unfolding, the soft murmur of words. These were sounds of continuity. Courtiers listened, scribes copied, kings reflected, and once the words were absorbed, eyes often returned to the remnants: the broken seal, the untied ribbon, the folded parchment now lying open. These fragments were not discarded. They were studied, stored, and remembered, for their silent language held weight equal to the sentences they guarded. In this way, seals, ribbons, and hidden marks became the poetry of governance. They were the small, steady notes in the music of rule, the details that gave texture to authority. For kings attuned to codes, they offered daily satisfaction, a reminder that power lay not only in armies or decrees, but also in subtleties, the way meaning could be shaped quietly, patiently, and with craft, like a cipher solved by firelight, like a pattern glimpsed in stone or music. These hidden signs reassured kings that beneath the surface of words, the world always held more to discover, and so the rhythm continued. Letters left castles at dawn, their wax still soft from pressing, their ribbons still bright with dye. They rode through valleys and across rivers, through villages where children paused to watch the passing horsemen. Days later, they arrived at another hall, another chamber, where seals were studied, ribbons untied, folds smoothed open. Each journey completed the cycle, each letter a small arc of connection across the kingdom. It was slow, patient, steady, the very essence of medieval life. To hold such a letter, to break such a seal, was to participate in a centuries-old language of trust and secrecy. It was to feel the quiet pride of craft, the endurance of custom, and the presence of hidden meaning. And in the stillness of a medieval hall, where the only sounds were the scratch of quills, the shuffle of feet, and the distant crackle of fire, that hidden language spoke most clearly of all. In the heart of a medieval castle, beyond the great halls with their high beams and echoing chambers, lay the courtyard, a space of open air enclosed by stone. Here, life unfolded at a pace that was both steady and unhurried, a rhythm that reflected the deeper pulse of the kingdom itself. The courtyard was neither entirely private nor fully public. It was a middle ground, a place where servants crossed paths with nobles, where children played in the sun while guards leaned against walls, where pigeons wheeled overhead and shadows of towers fell across cobblestones. The air carried sounds that were softer than those of markets or battlefields, the clink of a pail against a well, the splash of water poured into troughs, the muffled murmur of voices sharing words both plain and hidden. To walk into a courtyard was to step into a world of subtleties, where life showed itself in gestures, in tones, in signs that lingered beneath the surface. The ground itself told stories. Courtyards were paved with cobblestones, worn smooth by countless footsteps. Each stone bore the imprint of passing generations, the hurried stride of a messenger, the steady gait of a steward, the playful skips of children at their games. In the warmth of summer, the stones radiated heat, glowing faintly underfoot like muted embers. In winter, frost crept across them in delicate patterns, etching temporary designs that melted with the morning sun. A king standing in his courtyard might notice how these cobblestones mirrored his own kingdom, layered, worn, bearing the weight of countless lives, yet still enduring. At the center of many courtyards lay a fountain or a well, the source of water and a gathering place for daily needs. The murmur of water spilling into a stone basin provided a constant backdrop, soft and calming, like a chant without words. Servants came with buckets, bending in practiced rhythm, lifting with steady arms, and carrying the liquid life back to kitchens or chambers. The fountain was more than utility. It was a symbol of continuity, its flow unbroken even when human affairs shifted like clouds overhead. Kings who delighted in hidden codes might have looked upon the ripples spreading across the water's surface and imagined them as messages, circles of meaning radiating outward, quiet yet enduring. Pigeons often nested in the eaves of towers, their wings catching the sunlight as they circled above. Their presence was so ordinary that it might go unnoticed, yet to the attentive eye, they were part of the courtyard's rhythm. Their flight, the way they turned as one body, the sudden burst upward at the sound of a door opening, all carried a kind of pattern. To a king attuned to symbols, even these birds might seem like messengers, embodying the quiet communication of the courtyard. In their coos and rustling feathers was a music of constancy, a reminder that life persisted in forms humble yet beautiful. Children's laughter occasionally brightened the space, though even play in a courtyard was never loud or disorderly. Wooden hoops rolled across the stones, small carved toys clattered as they were dragged along, and simple games were played with chalk marks or stones set in lines. To see children at play was to glimpse innocence framed by stone walls, a fleeting joy that contrasted with the solemn duties of kingship. Yet even these games carried patterns, rules understood, signals exchanged, turns taken in silence. A king who loved codes might smile at this, seeing in children's play the same essence as in letters and ciphers, a structure hidden within spontaneity, an order concealed within seeming chance. Conversations in the courtyard unfolded at their own pace. Servants spoke in low tones as they passed, exchanging small remarks about tasks completed or meals prepared. Guards leaned on their spears, muttering softly about weather or watch rotations. Nobles, when they crossed the space, often spoke in measured words, their phrases polished yet layered with suggestion. Kings listening to these voices knew that not every word meant only what it seemed. Double meanings lingered in turns of phrase, and intent could be veiled behind politeness. A sentence about the ripening of apples in the orchard might carry an undertone about the readiness of alliances. A remark on the sturdiness of horses could quietly reference the strength of troops. Such subtleties gave life to the courtyard's speech, making it a place of conversation that was as much about what was unsaid as what was spoken. The architecture of the courtyard shaped these interactions. High walls enclosed the space, muting outside noise and focusing attention inward. Arched windows looked down upon the square. Balconies offered vantage points for quiet observation, and doorways opened from chambers onto the open air. A king, stepping out from his private rooms, could pause at a balcony to observe without being noticed. You might see servants moving with purpose, courtiers lingering in shaded corners, guards pacing steadily. The very design of the courtyard allowed for both openness and concealment, a stage where life unfolded in plain sight, but with layers of hidden meaning for those who cared to read them. Plants sometimes softened the stone. Herbs grew in small, garden plots tucked against walls, rosemary and thyme releasing their scent when brushed by passing hands. Vines crept along surfaces, their green leaves a contrast to the grey of masonry. In summer, flowers in pots added color, while in winter, evergreen boughs brought touches of life to an otherwise stark space. The presence of plants reminded all that even within walls, nature's cycles persisted. To a king, these growing things were signs of renewal, their patterns as rich and meaningful as any cipher. The unfurling of leaves, the rhythm of blossoms, the slow decay into autumn, all spoke of time's passage in forms subtle yet certain. In the afternoon, sunlight streamed into the courtyard at an angle, casting long shadows across the stones. These shadows shifted gently as hours passed, marking time more reliably than any clock. A king could stand and watch how a tower's silhouette crept across the ground, how the shadow of a balcony stretched and then withdrew. It was a natural sundial, a quiet testament to order and passage. Those who loved codes might see in these shadows the same geometry as in parchment ciphers, lines and angles drawn by light itself, fleeting yet precise. The sounds of the courtyard were always muted. The shuffle of feet, the clatter of a bucket, the soft drip of water, the coo of pigeons, the murmur of voices all combined into a gentle hum. It was a soundscape of calm, never rushed, never harsh. Even the occasional ring of metal, a blacksmith sharpening a tool, a guard adjusting armor, seemed softened by the space. This auditory calm lent itself to reflection. A king walking slowly across the stones might find his thoughts aligning with the rhythm of the place. Each sound a reminder that life, though filled with hidden meanings, could also be simple and steady. Evenings in the courtyard carried their own tranquility. As the sun dipped, torches were lit, their flames flickering against stone. Shadows deepened, conversations grew quieter, and the air cooled. The day's tasks wound down, and the courtyard became a place of pause before night settled fully. Courtiers might linger in quiet groups, their voices lowered, while servants finished their duties with deliberate calm. A king observing such a scene would see his household at rest, yet still woven together by the invisible threads of duty and loyalty. The torches cast light on ribbons of smoke, on faces softened by dusk, on the still surface of the fountain. It was a scene that spoke of peace, though beneath it the codes of speech and gesture still flowed, subtle and enduring. To dwell upon the courtyard was to recognize it as a microcosm of the kingdom itself. It held innocence in children's play, labor in servants' steps, vigilance in guards' watch, authority in the king's presence, and secrecy in the layered meanings of words. Each stone, each ripple of water, each shifting shadow contributed to a language as rich as any cipher. And for kings who loved codes, the courtyard was a reminder that hidden meanings were not confined to parchment or music or stone carvings. They were present in daily life, in the way words carried double weight, in the way gestures conveyed unspoken intent, in the way silence itself could be filled with suggestion. Thus, the courtyard endured as a place of calm and quiet power. It was not a battlefield or a council chamber, not a church or a library. Yet in its simplicity, it carried layers of meaning that were every bit as deep. A king who paused to listen, to observe, to notice the subtleties of conversation and the quiet beauty of stone and shadow, could find in the courtyard a kind of cipher for his realm. It whispered of continuity, of balance, of order hidden within ordinary life. And as the hours passed, as pigeons circled, as fountains murmured, as words drifted on the air, the courtyard spoke in its own language, patient, subtle, and enduring. Beyond the stone walls of castles and monasteries, where air grew thick with incense or smoke, there often lay a quieter world, the herbal garden. These spaces, though modest compared to grand halls or chapels, held a kind of power that kings and courtiers respected in their own way. Neatly ordered plots stretched out in simple beds, divided by narrow paths of packed earth or stone, each row containing plants with names whispered in reverence: sage, thyme, rosemary, rue, fennel, lavender, and countless more. The fragrance drifted on the air, subtle yet unmistakable, weaving together a tapestry of scents that spoke of healing, of memory, and sometimes of secrecy. To step into such a garden was to leave behind the noise of governance and enter a softer rhythm of life, where remedies grew from soil and meaning could be drawn from leaves and blossoms. Physicians and apothecaries tended these gardens with patience. Their tools were simple: a small knife, a wicker basket, sometimes just bare hands. They worked in silence more often than not, moving carefully among the plants, examining leaves for signs of health, clipping stalks with measured precision. Each herb had its season, its time to be sown, its moment to be harvested. To know this rhythm was to read nature's own code, a cycle as steady and profound as the movement of stars. Just as scribes bent over parchment to inscribe letters, these keepers of plants bent over soil, inscribing knowledge into the very landscape. Kings who loved secret languages might look upon such work and see parallels to their own. Fascination's symbols hidden in plain sight, meaning waiting for the patient eye. The garden was not only a place of utility, but also of quiet beauty. Bees hummed gently among blossoms, their slow drifting from flower to flower, adding a sound of constancy. The low walls enclosing the garden were sometimes covered with ivy, giving shade in summer and protection in colder months. Birds darted down to peck at seeds, while the occasional cat stretched lazily in patches of sunlight. The air carried layers of fragrance, sharpness from mint, sweetness from lavender, the earthiness of sage. Walking through the space, one might feel that every breath carried both medicine and poetry, a mingling of necessity and calm. Kings, stepping into such gardens, often found them soothing spaces where governance and ambition could momentarily give way to the subtler language of leaves. The remedies themselves reflected this union of practicality and symbolism. A sprig of rosemary was believed to sharpen memory, and so it appeared not only in cooking, but also in rituals of remembrance. Sage was praised for its cleansing qualities, thyme for courage, rue for protection. Physicians recorded these properties carefully, yet they also spoke of them in ways that suggested more than medicine. To offer rosemary might also mean loyalty. To present rue could signify regret. In this way, the garden's plants carried double weight, as cures for the body and as codes for the mind. A king attuned to hidden meanings could read bouquets as messages, each herb a letter in a fragrant cipher. Within the hushed chambers of castles, remedies prepared from these gardens found their way into daily life. A servant might steep chamomile for restless sleep or grind fennel seeds to ease digestion after feasts. Lavender was tucked into linens to sweeten the air, while ointments of comfrey soothed bruises. Every jar and vial on a physician's shelf carried knowledge distilled from the garden, a small portion of soil transformed into aid. Yet these concoctions, like coded messages, often required interpretation. Dosages were not fixed, effects varied, and the line between healing and harm could be thin. To trust an herbalist was to place faith in one who could read the subtle signs of nature, a kind of cryptographer of the living world. In some courts, herbs also shaped rituals of power. Before councils, kings might be offered sprigs of rue to ward off ill fortune, or rosemary to sharpen their memory before hearing petitions. In religious ceremonies, branches of yew or laurel were carried as symbols of eternity. Courtiers, attuned to such gestures, sometimes wove their own silent exchanges through herbs. A small posy presented in passing could say what words dared not: devotion, apology, warning, or hope. These were not messages sealed in wax or etched in stone, but they carried a weight that was understood by those who knew the code. The herbal garden, then, was not only a place of healing, but also a treasury of symbols, its language as nuanced as any cipher devised in a scriptorium. Even kings themselves took interest in these meanings. Some studied herbal texts, richly illuminated manuscripts that described plants with both scientific and mystical reverence. These books combined careful drawings of leaves and blossoms with descriptions of their powers: cures for fevers, aids for childbirth, protections against evil. Margins sometimes bore curious symbols, shorthand notes by physicians, or cryptic marks that suggested deeper layers of meaning. A king flipping through such a manuscript might pause over a simple sprig of thyme, noting not only its role in curing coughs, but also its association with courage, a quality he sought in both himself and his knights. In such readings, the boundary between medicine and metaphor blurred, and the herbal garden revealed itself as a living library of signs. The rhythm of tending herbs mirrored the rhythm of ruling a kingdom. Weeds had to be removed before they choked growth, just as disloyalty had to be checked before it spread. Soil needed care and nourishment, much like the people of the realm. Plants thrived when pruned at the right time, just as councils thrived when guided by measured judgment. For a king inclined to reflection, walking through a garden could become a meditation on governance itself. Each sprig and stalk became a symbol of balance. Too little attention led to withering. Too much interference disrupted growth. The lesson was quiet but profound, whispered by leaves rustling in the breeze. During winter, when gardens lay dormant under frost, herbs preserved from earlier months were brought forth. Dried sprigs hung from rafters, jars of salves lined shelves, powders rested in small packets. Even then, the presence of these plants was felt. They carried the memory of summer, of buzzing bees and fragrant air, into the colder season. To drink a tea of dried mint in January was to recall the warmth of July, a reminder that cycles endured. Kings valued this continuity, for it mirrored the persistence of codes and symbols. Though seasons changed, meaning endured, waiting to be read anew. The secretive aspect of herbs extended beyond symbolic gestures. Some remedies themselves were closely guarded, known only to a few physicians trusted by the crown. Recipes for rare salves or tinctures were passed in hushed tones, sometimes written in coded form to prevent misuse. The blending of herbs could be as guarded as the crafting of a cipher, each ingredient carrying significance, each measure deliberate. A wrong substitution could undo the work, just as a misplaced letter might unravel a code. To keep such knowledge was a responsibility heavy with both power and caution. In the dim light of a chamber, as powders were ground and liquids distilled, the physician's work resembled that of a scribe encoding secrets, careful, precise, and shrouded in quiet. There were also darker shades to this practice. Not every herb healed, some harmed. Belladonna, hemlock, and foxglove carried beauty, but also danger. In careful amounts, they could ease pain or regulate the heart. In excess, they could bring swift death. Kings, ever wary of betrayal, knew the double edge of these remedies. A goblet of wine laced with the wrong tincture could end a reign as surely as a sword. Thus, gardens were places of trust and suspicion, alike sanctuaries of healing but also potential arsenals of quiet power. Codes hidden in herbs were not always poetic. Sometimes they were deadly, messages written in the language of survival. Yet, despite these shadows, the prevailing spirit of the herbal garden was one of care. It was a space where hands worked, not for conquest but for comfort, where leaves rustled with promise rather than threat. In the gentle labor of weeding, planting, harvesting, and preparing, there was a rhythm of devotion to life's continuance. Bees moved steadily among blossoms. Sunlight warmed stones, water trickled into troughs, and physicians bent low to gather what would help others. Kings, in their restless seeking for order and meaning, often found solace here, where hidden codes of healing whispered alongside the fragrance of time. In the stillness of evening, when the day's work was done, the herbal garden lingered in memory. The scents clung to clothes. The images of blossoms and stalks remained in the mind's eye. The hum of bees seemed to echo even after silence returned. A king reflecting upon such a garden might see it as more than earth and plant. It was a cipher of existence itself, layers of meaning, cycles of growth, a union of necessity and beauty. To read the language of herbs was to glimpse a truth both practical and profound, that healing, like code-making, required patience, precision, and a willingness to look beyond the obvious. In this way, the garden remained a quiet sanctuary, a place where symbols grew as surely as roots, and where kings and commoners alike could find both remedy and reflection. In medieval halls, the sound of weaving was as steady as the rhythm of footsteps along stone passages or the creak of wooden doors swinging open to the morning air. Looms stood in corners of chambers or in workshops, their frames tall and rigid, waiting for hands to bring them to life. Threads, once spun from wool or flax, stretched taut across the beams, aligned like rows of soldiers yet gentler, holding no swords, only the promise of cloth. A weaver's hand moved patiently, carrying the shuttle back and forth, each pass adding a line, each beat of the comb pressing threads into place. In the dim light of a chamber, warmed by the glow of a hearth, this quiet labor created a fabric that was more than a garment. It was a record of care, of time, of steady attention. Kings and courtiers who walked among these spaces often saw more than cloth being made. Two minds fascinated by hidden meaning, weaving itself became a metaphor for words, for codes, for the silent art of arranging letters as carefully as threads. Writing, too, followed a rhythm. In the stillness of a scriptorium or a clerk's study, a quill scratched upon parchment, dipping now and again into ink, returning to the page with renewed steadiness. Letters grew one by one, aligned in tidy rows, the spaces between them measured like the spacing of threads upon a loom. Just as a weaver worked with dyed yarns to create patterns of color, so too did a scribe vary his marks to create emphasis, ornament, or coded detail. Words could be plain, just as cloth could be simple, yet with care they could be arranged into intricate designs, tapestries of meaning that revealed more to those who looked closely. Kings who delighted in secret codes often spoke of writing as weaving, the metaphor clear in their minds that every sentence was a fabric, every cipher a hidden embroidery upon the surface of language. The workshop of a weaver carried its own sensory atmosphere, much like the scriptorium. The smell of wool lingered in the air, mingling with the faint tang of dyes prepared in earthen pots. Indigo, madder, and woad gave color to yarns, transforming pale threads into deep blues, rich reds, and earthy yellows. The sound of the shuttle echoed softly, a constant back and forth like the ticking of a clock, though no clock was present. Light streamed through narrow windows, catching dust that floated lazily in beams. All around lay baskets of yarn, combs, and tools, each with its place, each part of the quiet process of turning raw fiber into fabric. To enter such a room was to step into a rhythm not unlike prayer, measured, repetitive, calming. The same could be said of chambers where scribes worked. Parchment bore the faint smell of animal skin, ink glistened wet before it dried, and pages stacked slowly, one after another, building not fabric but knowledge, a different sort of textile spun from words. Weaving was often women's work in households, while writing, particularly in royal or clerical circles, was the domain of men. Yet the similarity between the two was noted by many. Queens and noblewomen worked looms not only for utility but also for beauty, creating tapestries that depicted stories, myths, and symbols. These great cloths hung upon castle walls, telling silent tales to all who passed by. Their threads carried messages of heritage, victory, or devotion, woven in colors brighter than ink upon vellum. Kings, gazing upon such tapestries, could not help but compare them to their own coded writings, in which every line carried layers of meaning. A tapestry of wool and a manuscript of parchment seemed distant at first, yet upon reflection, they mirrored each other, patterns meant to endure, silent witnesses to the passing of time. The metaphor of weaving extended beyond appearances, just as a weaver might choose which threads to highlight. Scribes crafting secret codes decided which letters would bear meaning, which would remain ordinary, and which would be hidden altogether. Some codes relied on spacing, like gaps in fabric, that revealed a subtle pattern. Others hid words inside acrostics or symbols, much as a weaver might tuck a signature into the corner of a tapestry, visible only to those who knew where to look. Kings fascinated by secrecy found joy in this comparison. That writing was not just the setting down of words, but the crafting of a textile for the mind, where patterns of thought were bound together and secured against unraveling. For the people who lived in that world, the act of weaving was a part of daily life, grounding them in routine. Children learned to spin flax into thread, women wove cloth for garments, and guilds of weavers in towns produced bolts of fabric that filled markets. This fabric clothed bodies, covered tables, curtained windows, and formed banners that fluttered in the wind. It was everywhere, silent yet necessary. Words, too, clothed lives. They filled prayers, charters, contracts, and chronicles, weaving together communities with promises and stories. A village market, where bolts of cloth were sold, carried the same quiet undercurrent as a scriptorium beneath the surface. Both offered threads that bound society together. Kings, standing at the center, understood that to weave fabric and to weave words were parallel tasks, each creating strength, each requiring patience, each shaping how people lived and remembered. In monasteries, monks sometimes described their work in weaving terms. To copy scripture was to weave divine words into a fabric of human understanding. Marginalia, those small notes and decorations added to the sides of pages, became stitches of individuality, threads of personality woven into a larger cloth of sacred text. Kings who visited such places, or who received books as gifts, saw in them a quiet resemblance to the tapestries that adorned their halls. Both were costly, both required years of labor, and both preserved memory in forms meant to last across generations. A tapestry might warm the eye with color, while a manuscript warmed the mind with knowledge. Both could carry codes, some visible, others hidden. The metaphor reached even further into thought. To govern, a king needed to weave together the wills of lords, the customs of regions, the demands of the church, and the needs of common folk. Each strand had to be placed carefully, with tension balanced. Too loose, and the fabric of the realm unraveled. Too tight, and it tore. The art of ruling was itself a loom, upon which the threads of human lives were drawn and bound. Kings, aware of this metaphor, sometimes spoke of themselves as weavers of order, binding diverse parts into a whole. To those with a love of codes, governance itself could feel like a cipher, patterns of loyalty and dissent, revealed only to the careful eye, requiring interpretation and adjustment. Seasons, too, added their own rhythm. In winter, weaving continued indoors while the land slept under frost. In spring, sheep were sheared, flax was pulled from fields, and spinning wheels began anew, producing threads for another year. Words followed a similar cycle, charters renewed in spring councils, chronicles updated at the year's turning, letters sealed and sent with the rhythm of political life. Just as cloth kept bodies warm, words kept bonds alive. They preserved agreements, reassured allies, and reminded subjects of the king's will. In both fabric and writing, patience was rewarded. Neither could be rushed without weakening the whole. Kings found in this slowness a mirror for their own task of enduring rule, where haste brought instability, and steady labor brought strength. Within castles, courtyards sometimes displayed both woven cloth and written pages. Banners hung in the breeze while heralds read aloud proclamations, each carrying meaning to those who looked and listened. The page and the tapestry existed side by side, two forms of woven language, one with threads, the other with ink. Courtiers, attuned to subtlety, might glance at patterns in cloth while hearing the rhythm of words, noting the interplay between the two. To live in such a world was to be surrounded by weaving, both visible and invisible. Every cloak carried the labor of countless hands. Every document carried the careful thought of scribes. Both, in their own ways, carried codes, silent messages of belonging, identity, or power. By evening, when the work of the day slowed, looms grew still, and the scratch of quills softened to silence. Fires flickered in hearths, warming both weavers and scribes. Threads lay waiting, quills rested, inkpots closed. Yet the fabric of their labor endured, hanging in halls or stored in chests, placed upon shelves or carried by messengers. Kings who paused at such moments might feel the stillness of connection the way threads and words alike outlived the hands that made them. Just as a cloak wrapped warmth around shoulders, so too could a written word wrap memory around time, binding one generation to the next. Thus, weaving and writing remained twin arts of the Middle Ages, each requiring patience, each producing quiet beauty, each carrying the possibility of secrecy. Codes were woven into cloth through patterns, and woven into words through letters. Kings who delighted in both found themselves not only rulers of lands, but also readers of hidden fabrics, interpreters of silent messages threaded through life itself. To watch a loom at work was to hear an echo of a scriptorium. To read a coded text was to feel the rhythm of weaving. Both spoke in patterns, both endured across centuries. Both reminded those who observed them that meaning often lies hidden in the steady work of human hands. And so the loom and the quill, though different in substance, told the same quiet story, that of threads drawn together, patterns shaped with care, and messages carried silently through time, whether in fabric that warmed the body or in codes that stirred the mind. Weaving remained the essence of connection, a reminder that the world itself was a vast tapestry, and that every life, every word, every hidden cipher was a thread within it. As the sun slipped lower in the sky, the castle walls began to change. Their grey stone, so stark in midday light, softened beneath the colors of dusk. Shadows stretched long across the battlements, blurring edges, deepening corners, and giving the fortress a gentler face. The day's noise hammer strikes in the smithy, shouts in the courtyard. The rattle of hooves on cobbles faded slowly, replaced by a quieter rhythm. Within this hush, twilight settled like a cloak, wrapping the castle in stillness. Watchmen climbed the towers, their boots sounding steady against worn stone, while torches sputtered to life in brackets along the walls. Each small flame bent in the breeze, casting pools of amber that danced on the surface of the rock. The air smelled faintly of smoke and evening earth, as if the castle itself exhaled after a long day of labor and ceremony. For a king, twilight was a time of pause. The weight of audiences, councils, and proclamations lifted as the sun dipped below the horizon. Matters of law and tribute, petitions from subjects, and letters sealed with wax were now set aside. Instead, on a wooden table in his private chamber, a few documents remained, marked with symbols or notes that bore meaning beyond their surface. A loaf of bread, begun but unfinished, and a goblet of wine grown cool, accompanied them, untouched for hours. These small details spoke of a mind turned inward, one absorbed not by feasts or music, but by thoughts lingering on codes written earlier in the day. The quiet hours of twilight lent themselves to reflection, when secrets felt closer, as if drawn out by the dimming light. The castle walls themselves played their part in this mood. Built for defense, their stones also bore the memory of countless evenings like this, when sun and torchlight mingled upon them. Moss clung to their lower edges, ivy traced paths across their faces, and narrow slits looked out toward fading fields. Beyond, the land grew shadowed, with strips of farmland dimming into greys, forests darkening into indistinct masses, and rivers reflecting the last glimmers of day. From a high balcony, the king could gaze outward and feel the stillness of his domain settling into night. Just as daylight revealed order, the lines of crops, the bustle of market's twilight revealed mystery. It was a time when outlines blurred, when sound carried differently, when the ordinary felt tinged with secrecy. For a man fascinated by hidden meanings, this hour seemed made for meditation. The routines of the watchmen mirrored the king's contemplations. Their pace was steady, not hurried, as they moved along walkways with spears in hand. Each paused to look outward, to mark the line of trees, the shimmer of water, the faint glow of distant cottages preparing for night. Theirs was a language, a vigilance, a watchful code shared by glance and gesture. A lifted hand, a nod, a pause at a particular spot. These small movements carried more meaning than speech. Just as scribes wove letters into patterns on parchment, so too did guards weave their silent signals into the rhythm of twilight duty. The king, observing from his chamber or balcony, might see in them another form of cipher, simple, practical, yet quiet and enduring. Inside the castle, torches lit inner passages where courtiers moved less briskly than in the day. Servants carried trays, their steps softened by rushes laid upon stone floors. Pages collected parchments and stored them in wooden chests, while Scribes cleaned their quills and capped their inkwells. The great hall grew hushed after supper, its long tables cleared, its benches empty. Fireplaces, once roaring with heat, now glowed with softer embers, filling the air with warmth that was no longer urgent but companionable. In private chambers, courtiers spoke in subdued tones, their laughter gentler, their words fewer. All these small transitions carried the same feeling: twilight's invitation to rest, to step back from the demands of daylight, to inhabit a softer rhythm. The king, however, often found his thoughts turning not to sleep but to contemplation. He leaned over parchments scattered with unfamiliar signs, half-finished codes or messages awaiting deciphering. The flicker of a nearby torch or candle gave the ink a faint gleam, as if the letters themselves breathed with hidden life. He read slowly, tracing symbols with a finger, pausing at lines that suggested double meanings. To him, the quiet of twilight was not empty, it was filled with whispers. Words once written now seemed to murmur, their secrets closer in the dimness. Outside, the watchman's slow tread echoed faintly, a counterpoint to the rhythm of his thoughts. Each sound of boot on stone reminded him that he was not alone, yet within his chamber he felt enclosed in a world of signs, where messages waited like stars to be discovered. Twilight itself carried symbolism that appealed to his imagination. Just as the sun withdrew and stars appeared, so too did plain words give way to hidden meanings when read with careful eyes. Daylight belonged to the obvious: fields, duties, proclamations. Night belonged to mystery, codes, dreams, secrets. Twilight was the threshold between, a liminal space where one slipped from the known into the hidden. Kings who loved secret languages often lingered at this edge, preferring the balance of half-light, where both clarity and obscurity lived side by side. The lengthening shadows across the castle walls mirrored the depth of thought within his chamber, both stretching into places unseen, both quiet, both unhurried. Around the castle, the sounds of village life softened as well. Dogs barked distantly, then settled. Carts no longer rattled, and only the occasional voice carried upward from the fields below. Smoke rose in thin lines from cottages, blending with the cool evening air. Bells tolled from chapels, marking the passage from day into night, their tones slow and measured, spreading across the land like ripples on water. For those beyond the castle walls, twilight meant rest after labor, the sharing of bread and ale, the closing of shutters against the chill. For the king within, it meant a different kind of rest, the quiet companionship of symbols, the stillness that allowed hidden words to speak. As stars emerged, faint at first and then steadier, the sky above the battlements grew deep and wide. Watchmen tilted their heads to note constellations, just as farmers did, for the stars guided not only defense but also planting, travel, and story. To a king attuned to codes, the stars themselves resembled a vast text, each point of light a letter, each constellation a pattern. The heavens were a manuscript spread across the night, waiting to be read. Just as no fabric was woven without care, no code written without pattern, so too was no sky empty of meaning. Twilight was the moment when this great celestial book opened, inviting reflection. Within chambers, the king might close his eyes for a moment, letting the hush settle. Bread cooled, wine darkened, parchments waited. The fire cast shadows against the walls, shapes that flickered like half-formed letters. He listened not for noise but for silence, the silence that allowed thought to move freely, that made space for secrets to emerge. In that stillness, codes did not feel like puzzles to be solved, but like companions in contemplation, threads woven into his own reflections. He did not rush to finish them. Like twilight itself, they were meant to linger, to unfold slowly, to carry him gently from one hour into the next. Thus the castle at twilight was not merely a fortress, but a living space of symbols and silence. Its stones absorbed the day's labor and released it into calm. Its watchmen marked the edges of night with patient steps. Its torches burned low, steady beacons that kept darkness at bay without banishing it entirely. For the king, all of this formed a setting as steady and comforting as the codes upon his table. Both castle and parchment offered quiet endurance. Both reminded him that meaning survived beyond the noise of the day. Twilight, with its shadows and its hush, gave him the perfect space to dwell in that truth. And so the evening deepened, unhurried, soft, and calm. Stars spread across the sky, torches glowed against stone. Watchmen kept their steady rounds, and within a chamber, The king rested in thought. The world around him grew still, and the codes before him remained, their secrets waiting without urgency. Twilight over the castle walls was not an end, but a gentle pause, a reminder that even in silence, meaning endured. In that quiet hour, between day and night, the king found a companion in hidden words, as steady as the stone walls, themselves as constant as the stars above. Time passes slowly in memory. What was once urgent, an encoded letter carried by a courier in the rain, a seal pressed hurriedly into wax, a hidden carving on a beam in a great hall softens across centuries until only its quiet essence remains. The kings who leaned over parchments in flickering candlelight are long gone, their crowns resting in tombs, their counsels dispersed into history. Yet the spirit of their fascination survives, not in the codes themselves, but in the rhythm of their making, the gentle act of placing pen to parchment, of shaping lines and symbols, of pausing to reflect before continuing. These are the legacies that endured. They whisper to us, not of secrets withheld, but of calm cultivated. Across generations, many codes faded into obscurity. Some were solved by careful eyes, their mysteries unveiled and placed plainly in books. Others resisted all attempts, remaining silent, their meanings hidden beyond recovery. But in the long story of these hidden words, it was never the solution that mattered most. What endured was the stillness they offered in the moment of creation. A king or scribe, bent over a desk, felt time slow as ink pooled at the tip of a quill and spread across vellum in deliberate strokes. Each mark, whether it concealed or revealed, was a meditation, like the sound of a bell marking the hour. The writing of codes carved gentle intervals into days otherwise crowded with noise. It is easy to imagine the quiet relief that such puzzles provided. For kings, burdened by councils, disputes, and the heavy weight of power, codes offered a private world untouched by politics. They could retreat from the chatter of courtiers and the demands of governance into something simpler. A cipher, once begun, asked only patience. It did not argue, did not betray, did not shift allegiance. It waited, calmly, to be completed. To work upon it was like tending a garden or stitching a garment, an act both delicate and enduring, grounded not in urgency but in rhythm. In this way, secret words became less a matter of statecraft and more a form of quiet devotion. Scribes, too, found peace in this art. In the cool air of the scriptorium, where quills scratched steadily upon stretched parchment, time itself seemed suspended. Even when codes were not involved, the careful copying of texts was a discipline of serenity. But when hidden symbols were added, when a letter was altered, when a phrase carried layered meanings, the work deepened into something more contemplative. The silence of the chamber, the faint smell of vellum, the glow of lamplight against ink, all wove together with the symbols themselves. What emerged on the page was not only communication but also stillness captured in form. Merchants in markets, masons carving stone, and even gardeners with herbs sometimes shared in this legacy. Their marks and symbols, practical though they were, carried the same essence. A chalk sign upon a crate, a mason's mark upon a block, a sprig of rue tucked meaningfully among other plants, all spoke in quiet language. None were loud or dramatic. They worked softly, shaping meaning in the background of daily life. Even when those meanings were eventually forgotten, the gestures remained. The drawing of the line, the pressing of the seal, the tying of the ribbon, the calm of the act itself mattered as much as the message conveyed. As centuries passed, the codes themselves became curiosities. Scholars puzzled over manuscripts whose symbols resisted translation. Antiquarians traced the faint carvings left. In cathedral stones, musicians wondered at notations in margins, herbalists at the layered language of plants. Each discovery was treated with excitement, yet also with quiet respect. To study an old code was to touch the past, not through battles or proclamations, but through something gentler. One met the past, not in its noise but in its pauses. It was as if the long-vanished king, the forgotten scribe, still leaned over the parchment beside you, still savoring the same patience, still breathing in the same hush. This is the gentle legacy, not drama, not revelation, but reminder. The codes remind us that even those who held crowns, even those tasked with rule and burdened with authority, needed calm. They turned to words, not only for power but for peace. To sit quietly with a puzzle, to trace lines that few others would ever see. was to claim a moment of humanity amid the weight of office. It told them, as it tells us, that within even the most public lives there can be corners of quiet, where the self retreats from noise and breathes more slowly. Today, when we encounter such codes in books, in museums, or in stories told at night, their exact solutions matter less than the feelings they carry. They remind us of candlelight on stone walls, of firelight glinting on parchment, of courtyards grown still at dusk. They recall the hush of chapels where music blended into patterns, the soft rustle of pages turned in libraries, the patient hands of scribes who wrote not for speed but for endurance. They are echoes of slow time, when the world moved at the pace of seasons, and every act of writing was measured and deliberate. Perhaps this is why the fascination with codes endures even now. We may no longer live in castles or write with quills upon vellum, yet the appeal of secret words remains. To puzzle over symbols, to seek meaning where none is immediately apparent, is to share in the same calm as those long-vanished kings. It is to feel time slow, to step briefly into a space, apart from daily noise. In that sense, the legacy is alive not only in archives, but in every quiet moment when we pause to reflect, when we let symbols or patterns draw us inward. So when we think of medieval codes, let us not imagine only secrecy and intrigue. Let us imagine stillness, a king leaning in candlelight, his face softened by shadows, his hands steady as he writes, a scribe pausing to let ink dry, listening to the silence of the scriptorium, a mason carving a mark upon stone, leaving behind a symbol that whispers even when its meaning is lost. These are not scenes of urgency, but of patience. They belong to the long rhythm of life, to the quiet hours when the world rests. In this way, the gentle legacy of secret words is not a tale of conflict, but of continuity. It shows us how, even in ages defined by battles and crowns, there were softer currents of thought, of symbol, of slow and steady writing. These currents flowed beneath the noise of history, carrying with them the reminder that power itself was not only displayed in gold and stone, but also in silence and ink. To remember this is to honor the fullness of the past, not only its triumphs, but also its tranquil hours. And so, as twilight falls across our own lives, we may still learn from those long-gone kings and scribes. We may pause, set aside the noise, and let our thoughts move slowly, tracing patterns not for revelation but for peace. In this way, their legacy continues not as secrecy to be guarded, but as serenity to be shared. For in the end, what remains of their hidden words is not the mystery they kept, but the calm they created. And that calm, quiet as parchment under candlelight, endures across centuries, waiting for us still. As we come to the end of our quiet journey through medieval halls, gardens, scriptoriums, and courtyards, let us pause one final time in the soft light of memory. What we have seen is not the thunder of armies or the clash of crowns, but the gentler currents of history, the ways in which kings, scribes, and ordinary people alike found peace in secret words. Across the span of 15 chapters, we have walked through still gardens at dawn, sat with monks in silent chambers, wandered village markets filled with quiet symbols, and watched lanterns bob upon rivers carrying hidden messages. We have felt the warmth of winter hearths, touched the carvings in stone and wood, entered libraries heavy with leather-bound volumes, and heard the patterns of music echo like codes in sacred chapels. We have traced the cycle of seasons, followed sealed letters carried by couriers, and stood in courtyards where whispers mingled with pigeons' wings. We have breathed the fragrance of herbs in physic gardens, watched weavers and scribes alike create patterns of meaning, lingered under twilight on castle walls, and finally arrived at the legacy of secret words, gentle, enduring, and serene. Through it all, one truth has remained. The codes themselves mattered less than the quiet they created. Kings obsessed with hidden meanings were not always searching for power or deception. Often they were searching for stillness. To sit with parchment, to mark it carefully with symbols known only to a few, was to find a rhythm slower than politics, deeper than ceremony. The quill became like a rosary bead, the act of writing like prayer. Codes offered a pause in days, crowded with counsel and noise. They were a retreat, a sanctuary carved, not in stone but in ink. For scribes, the work of hidden words was no different from the steady copying of sacred texts. It was a practice of patience, a devotion measured in hours and in strokes of the pen. Each page completed was less a triumph than a meditation, And when ciphers or secret signs appeared in those pages, they did not disturb the silence. They deepened it, reminding both writer and reader that meaning is not always on the surface. Sometimes it waits quietly underneath, like seeds beneath snow. In markets, masons' workshops, and herb gardens, we found echoes of the same impulse. Marks scratched upon crates or stone blocks, herbs chosen for layers of symbolism, and knots tied into ribbons all hinted at the human desire to say more than words can plainly speak. None of these were loud gestures. They were soft, almost invisible to the hurried eye. But for those who noticed, they created another layer of experience and awareness that life itself was threaded with quiet codes, waiting patiently to be read. Even music, flowing in chapels as monks sang their plainchant, was heard as pattern and cipher. The repetition of tones and phrases, the harmony rising and falling in ordered balance, carried a hidden logic. Kings attuned to secrecy might close their eyes and feel the chant as a code of sound, a puzzle of rhythm and silence. And yet, to the common worshipper, it remained simply prayer. This was the beauty of such hidden things. They could be many layers at once, offering peace to all, whether or not the secret was seen. The seasons themselves became a kind of language. Frost, blossom, harvest, and snow spoke in patterns as old as the earth. Kings who sought ciphers saw in these cycles an endless, unbroken code. Farmers read the fields as carefully as scribes read parchment, finding meaning in each sign of weather. In this, nature itself joined the quiet game of symbols, teaching patience, endurance, and calm. Letters sealed in wax, folded with deliberate care, or tied with ribbons, carried not just news but intention. To receive such a letter was to wonder whether the message lived in the ink or in the way it was folded. Couriers moved slowly through mud and dust, their pace steady, their mission patient. The journey of the letter became as much part of the message as the words inside. Everywhere we looked, whether in courtyards at noon or castle walls at dusk, the codes were less about secrecy than about rhythm. They slowed time. They taught watchfulness. They reminded kings and commoners alike that meaning is not always shouted, often it is whispered. And so, the final legacy of these secret words is not a record of victories or betrayals. It is the memory of stillness. It shows us that even those who lived under crowns and heavy responsibilities longed for peace in small acts. The scratch of a quill, the turning of a page, the carving of a mark, the humming of bees in an herb garden. These moments were the true inheritance, surviving across centuries as reminders that life is not only made of noise and conflict, but also of calm and patience. For us today, the codes remain partly mysterious. Scholars debate their meanings, collectors preserve them in books, and curious minds try to solve what was once hidden. Yet the solution matters less than the experience. To hold an old manuscript in one's hands, to see the faint lines of ink curling into unfamiliar shapes, is to touch a world where time moved slowly. It is to join, however briefly, with the kings and scribes who once paused in the same way, letting thought and symbol flow together in silence. That silence is what endures. It is the true gift of these hidden words, not the secrecy, not the puzzles solved or unsolved, but the calm they carried. They remind us that even in ages filled with challenge and burden, people found ways to breathe more slowly, to focus on small acts, to create beauty in quiet corners. Their lives, like ours, were filled with noise, but in the midst of it, they found peace in secret codes, and in that peace, they left us a legacy more lasting than power, the reminder to slow down, to notice patterns, and to rest. And so we end where we began, in the soft light of lanterns, with mist drifting over rivers and hearths glowing against stone walls. The kings who once puzzled over hidden words are gone, but the calm they found remains. It waits in old books, in carved stones, in faded letters, and in the patient rhythm of history itself. It waits in us, too, whenever we choose to set aside noise and listen instead for the quiet messages all around. In that way, the legacy of secret words continues gentle, enduring, and forever peaceful.